A cowboy sworn never to love again, a woman who fell asleep on his shoulder, and the moment that changed everything. In the violent heart of 1875 Wyoming, Caleb Rourke built walls around his heart, higher than any mountain range. 8 years of solitude, 8 years of running from the past. But when outlaws struck and a stranger's life fell into his hands, those walls began to crack. Sometimes the greatest danger isn't the gun pointed at your chest. It's the trust of someone who believes you're still worth saving. Stay with me until the end, and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The Wyoming wind carried the smell of sage and dust through the Canyon Pass station, mixing with the acrid smoke from Caleb Rourke's cigarette as he leaned against the weathered timber of the way station wall. His eyes, the color of storm clouds over the Rockies, scanned the horizon with the practiced wariness of a man who'd learned long ago that peace was just the silence between gunshots. "Rourke," the station master's voice cut through the afternoon heat. "Coach is running late. Hadley gang hit the Sweetwater route last week. You still willing to ride point?" Caleb crushed the cigarette beneath his boot heel, the leather worn smooth from 8 years of running from ghosts. "I signed on, didn't I?" The station master, a grizzled man named Tucker who'd seen the territory grow from wilderness to what passed for civilization, studied him with rheumy eyes. "Just making sure. Man, with your reputation, I figured you'd want to know what you're getting into." Reputation. Caleb nearly laughed at the word. Once he'd had a different kind of reputation. A good man, a husband, almost a father. Now he was just another gun for hire, drifting between towns like tumbleweeds, never staying long enough for anyone to ask about the shadows that lived behind his eyes. "The Hadley gang doesn't scare me," Caleb said, checking his Colt Peacemaker with the kind of casual efficiency that came from muscle memory. 6 rounds. Always 6 rounds. "Nothing much does anymore," Tucker grunted, recognizing the hollow truth in those words. He'd seen men like Caleb before, the ones who'd lost something so fundamental that they walked through life like they were already dead, just waiting for their bodies to catch up with their hearts. The stagecoach appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later, trailing a plume of dust that rose like smoke signals against the cloudless sky. Caleb watched it approach, noting the driver's cautious speed, the way the shotgun guard kept his weapon ready across his lap. Smart men. Careful men. The kind who might actually make it through this run alive. When the coach rattled to a stop in front of the station, Caleb was already mounting his horse, a steel-gray gelding named Smoke, who'd been with him for 5 years and knew better than to expect affection. The door opened, and 3 passengers stepped out to stretch their legs, a drummer selling patent medicines, a preacher with kind eyes and worn boots, and a woman. Caleb tried not to look at her, tried and failed. She wore a traveling dress, the color of deep water, practical but well-made, her dark hair pinned up beneath a modest hat. She moved with the kind of grace that spoke of finishing schools and piano lessons, completely out of place in this hard country. When she glanced his way, her eyes were the warm brown of honey in sunlight, and for just a moment, Caleb felt something crack in the permafrost of his chest. He looked away deliberately, focusing on adjusting his saddle, on checking his rifle, on anything but the way her presence seemed to gentle the harsh edges of the world. "Miss Alden," Tucker said, tipping his hat, "wasn't expecting someone like you on this run. Your father know you're traveling alone?" "My father knows I'm quite capable of managing myself, Mr. Tucker." Her voice was cultured but not cold, carrying a hint of steel beneath the politeness. "Though I appreciate your concern." Grace Alden. Caleb filed the name away in the part of his mind where he stored things he didn't want to think about. Banker's daughter, Tucker had mentioned in the briefing, traveling to Prescott to help establish a branch office. The kind of woman who belonged in drawing rooms and society functions, not rattling across hostile territory where the Hadley gang had already killed 2 drivers and a guard in the past month. "We should move," Caleb said to the driver, his voice rougher than he intended. "Sitting still makes us targets." The driver, a competent man named Morrison, nodded. "Mount up, folks. Next stop is Clearwater Spring, 20 miles west. We'll water the horses there and push through to Prescott before nightfall if we're lucky." "And if we're not lucky?" the preacher asked mildly. Morrison's jaw tightened. "Then we'll deal with what comes." Caleb urged Smoke into position ahead of the coach, deliberately putting distance between himself and the passengers. Point rider. That's what he'd been hired for. Scout the trail, watch for ambush sites, keep everyone alive. It didn't require conversation or connection. It just required vigilance and a willingness to put his body between danger and the people behind him. The fact that he'd been doing that for 8 years in every way that mattered was something he didn't let himself think about. They'd been on the trail for 90 minutes when Caleb first noticed the signs. Fresh tracks cutting across the road. 6 horses, maybe 7, moving fast. The kind of tracks that spoke of men with purpose and ill intent. He raised his hand, signaling Morrison to slow the coach, and walked Smoke forward to examine the ground more carefully. The earth told its story in scuffed hoofprints and broken sage. The riders had come from the north, circled back, then headed toward the narrow canyon up ahead. Textbook ambush positioning. The Hadley gang knew this country, knew every choke point and killing ground between here and the Colorado border. Caleb rode back to the coach, his expression grim. We've got company ahead. Could be nothing. Could be the Hadley boys setting up in Echo Canyon. Either way, we need to make a choice. Push through or find another route. Morrison wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cooling afternoon. Another route adds 4 hours and takes us through Shoshone territory. Last I heard, they weren't too friendly to white folks after what happened at Rock Springs. And pushing through a potential ambush? The shotgun guard, a young man named Billy with more courage than experience, tried to keep his voice steady. Could get us all killed, Caleb finished, but it's the fastest way to Prescott, and speed might be our best defense. Hadley doesn't know exactly when we're coming through. If we move fast and I scout ahead, we might slip past before they're in position. The coach door opened and Grace Alden leaned out. She'd been listening. Of course she had. Women like her always paid attention, always assessed situations with those intelligent eyes. What would you recommend, Mr. Rourke? She asked directly. Caleb met her gaze, felt that unwelcome crack in his armor widen just slightly. I'd recommend you stayed in Boston or Philadelphia or wherever you came from, Miss Alden. This isn't country for women? Her eyebrow arched with perfect aristocratic disdain. How fortunate, then, that I'm not asking for your opinion on my life choices. I'm asking for your professional assessment of our tactical situation. Despite himself, despite the walls he'd built and maintained for nearly a decade, Caleb felt the corner of his mouth twitch. Spirit. She had spirit beneath that polished exterior, the kind of backbone you needed to survive out here, though he doubted she'd ever had to test it. Push through, he said, fast and hard. If they're setting up, we hit them before they're ready. If they're not there, we make Prescott by dark. He looked at Morrison. Can your team handle a hard run through the canyon? They'll handle whatever I ask them to handle, Morrison said with the confidence of a man who knew his horses. But if shooting starts, you keep those horses running no matter what, Caleb cut in. Don't stop, don't slow down, don't look back. I'll buy you whatever time you need. One man against the Hadley gang? Billy's voice cracked slightly. That's suicide. Caleb's smile was cold as winter wind. Maybe. But I'm harder to kill than I look. He didn't add that part of him had been looking for a reason to die with purpose for 8 years now. Didn't mention that the ghost of his wife Sarah still visited him in dreams, her belly swollen with the child who never got to draw breath, both of them lost to a Cheyenne raid that took everything that mattered. What was the point? These people didn't need his tragedy. They just needed him to do his job. Everyone inside, Morrison ordered. Check your weapons if you have them. We're going through. Grace Alden's eyes lingered on Caleb for a moment longer, assessing, calculating, seeing something that made her expression soften just slightly. Then she withdrew into the coach, and Caleb was grateful. He didn't need her pity or her curiosity or whatever that look had been. He rode point as they approached Echo Canyon, every sense heightened, reading the landscape like a book written in stone and shadow. The canyon walls rose 60 feet on either side, striated limestone that channeled the wind into mournful whispers. Perfect place for an ambush. Perfect place to die. Smoke's ears flicked forward, and Caleb's hand moved to his rifle before his conscious mind registered the danger. There. Movement on the western rim, about 200 yards ahead. Sunlight glinting off metal, the flash of a bandana. Contact! Caleb roared, wheeling Smoke around. Morrison! Run them! Now! The world exploded into chaos. Gunfire erupted from both rims of the canyon, muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers against the rock face. Bullets whined through the air, striking sparks off stones, punching through the wooden sides of the coach. Morrison cracked his whip, and the team lunged forward, the coach lurching into a desperate gallop. Caleb didn't run. He charged toward the ambush, rifle up, returning fire with methodical precision. One shot dropped a man on the eastern rim. He saw the body tumble, heard the scream cut short. Another shot forced two outlaws to duck back into cover. He wasn't trying to win this fight. He was trying to buy seconds, trying to give the coach the chance to break through. A bullet tugged at his sleeve. Another passed close enough to his head that he felt the air displacement. Caleb didn't flinch. Fear was for men who had something to lose. The coach thundered past him, Billy returning fire with his shotgun. The passengers invisible behind the window curtains Morrison had sensibly drawn. Caleb wheeled smoke and raced after them, providing covering fire, his rifle barking 3 more times before he had to reload. Then he saw him. Jack Hadley himself, recognizable from wanted posters and reputation, spurring his horse down a side trail to cut off the coach. The outlaw leader was flanked by 2 men, all 3 of them converging on the road ahead where the canyon narrowed even further. "Damn it," Caleb breathed, and asked Smoke for everything the gelding had. The horse responded like the veteran he was, muscles bunching, hooves pounding the hard-packed earth in a rhythm that matched Caleb's heartbeat. They closed the distance in seconds, and Caleb made his choice, the kind of choice that defined a man's character and usually ended his life. He angled Smoke directly at Hadley's group, drawing their fire toward him and away from the coach. Bullets sang past. One clipped his hat, sending it spinning away into the dust. Another grazed Smoke's flank, and the horse screamed but didn't break stride. Caleb fired his last 3 rounds. 1 man down, another wounded. Hadley forced to rein in hard to avoid the fusillade. It was enough. The coach shot through the gap, Billy whooping with desperate relief, but Caleb was trapped on the wrong side of Hadley's remaining men, and his rifle was empty. He holstered the rifle and drew his Colt Peacemaker in one fluid motion, firing as Hadley and 4 other gang members who'd descended from the rims converged on his position. The world narrowed to muzzle flashes, and the kick of the revolver in his hand, to Smoke wheeling beneath him, to the taste of gun smoke and blood. Someone's blood, maybe his own. A bullet punched into his left shoulder, spinning him in the saddle. Pain exploded white-hot through his nervous system, but Caleb's gun hand stayed steady. He put a round through the shoulder of the man who'd shot him, then spurred Smoke toward the only gap in the closing circle. They broke through in a spray of dust and adrenaline, but Hadley's voice followed them. "That's Rourke, the man who killed my brother. Don't let him reach that coach." So that's what this was about. Not just robbery, revenge. The universe had a vicious sense of humor sometimes. Caleb bent low over Smoke's neck, feeling blood soaking his shirt, trying to calculate how much he could afford to lose before his vision started to blur. Behind him, the gang was regrouping for pursuit. Ahead, the coach had made it out of the canyon and was racing across open ground toward a tree line about half a mile distant. They weren't going to make it. Not with Hadley's gang in full pursuit, not with Morrison's team already tired from the hard run. Caleb could see the mathematics of death playing out across the Wyoming plains. Could see exactly how this ended unless someone changed the equation. He changed it. Instead of following the coach, Caleb angled Smoke toward a rocky outcropping that offered defensive position. He'd make his stand there, draw the gang away from the coach long enough for Morrison to reach those trees and maybe, just maybe, find safety. But Morrison had other ideas. The coach slowed, then stopped. The door flew open, and Grace Alden stepped out, her traveling dress already dusty and disheveled. She was holding a Spencer carbine that looked like it had seen the Civil War, and she was waving at Caleb with desperate urgency. "Mr. Rourke, here! Get back in the coach!" Caleb roared, but his voice was weaker than he wanted, blood loss making the world tilt slightly. Grace ignored him completely. She raised the Spencer and fired twice at the pursuing gang, not hitting anyone but making them scatter for cover. The woman could shoot. Not well, but with enough competence to be dangerous. Caleb made another choice, the kind that went against every instinct of self-preservation he'd carefully cultivated. He turned Smoke toward the coach. He reached them in seconds that felt like hours, feeling bullets snap through the air around him. Morrison had turned the team, creating a barrier between the coach and the gang. Billy was reloading his shotgun with shaking hands. The preacher was praying loudly enough to be heard over the gunfire. "What the hell are you doing?" Caleb demanded as he reached Grace's side. "Saving your life," she said calmly, firing the Spencer again. "You're welcome." "I didn't need—" A wave of dizziness cut off his protest, and he swayed in the saddle. Grace's eyes went to his shoulder, to the spreading crimson stain, and her expression shifted from determined to alarmed. "You're hit." "I've been hit before." But even as he said it, Caleb knew this was bad. The bullet had gone clean through, which was good, but it had hit something important, artery maybe, or major muscle group. He was bleeding too fast. "Morrison," Grace's voice carried command that came from a lifetime of being obeyed. "We need to move. Now. Mr. Rourke needs medical attention." "We move. We're exposed," Morrison argued, but he was already gathering the reins. "Those trees are our best bet for defense." "Then get us there," Grace said, then turned to Caleb. "Can you ride? Can you mind your own business?" But the world was starting to gray at the edges, and Caleb knew he was maybe 30 seconds from falling off his horse. Grace knew it too. "Mr. Morrison, we need to take Mr. Rourke inside the coach." "No room," the drummer protested. "We're already cramped, and he's bleeding." "Then you can ride up top with Billy," Grace said with steel in her voice. "This man just saved all our lives. The least we can do is save his in return." Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to maintain his distance and his carefully constructed solitude, but his body was betraying him. When Grace reached up to help him dismount, he found himself accepting her assistance, found himself being half carried, half dragged into the coach. The interior smelled of lavender and leather and fear. Caleb collapsed onto the seat next to the preacher, who immediately began applying pressure to his wound with a surprisingly steady hand. The drummer scrambled out, muttering about blood on his sample cases. Grace climbed in last, pulling the door shut as Morrison whipped the team into motion. "Smoke," Caleb managed to say. "My horse—" "is following," Grace assured him, glancing out the window. "Animals are often smarter than their riders." Despite the pain, despite the blood loss, despite everything, Caleb almost smiled. "You always this bossy?" "I prefer decisive," Grace said, pulling off her gloves. "And right now, I'm deciding that you're not going to bleed to death in my presence. Reverend, keep that pressure steady. I need to examine the wound." "You a doctor?" Caleb asked. Though his vision was tunneling now, the coach interior seeming to recede into a long, dark corridor. "My mother believed young ladies should have practical skills as well as decorative ones," Grace said, her fingers gentle but efficient as she began unbuttoning his shirt. "I've assisted at births, set broken bones, and treated gunshot wounds during the draft riots in New York. This isn't my first crisis, Mr. Rourke." "Caleb," he heard himself say, "if you're going to undress me, least you can do is use my Christian name." Grace's laugh was unexpected, warm and genuine despite the circumstances. "Caleb, then. And I'm Grace, though I suspect you already knew that." He had known that, had tried not to know it, tried to keep her safely filed away as the banker's daughter, or the passenger, or anything that didn't make her real. But here in the close confines of the coach, with her hands on his skin and her eyes focused on keeping him alive, there was no distance left to maintain. The coach lurched over rough ground, and pain spiked through his shoulder hard enough to drag a groan from his throat. Grace's expression tightened with sympathy, but her hands stayed steady. "Reverend, I need you to tear strips from my petticoat," she said. "Clean ones, from the hem." The preacher, who'd introduced himself as Reverend Thomas earlier, didn't even blink. "Yes, ma'am." He began ripping fabric with practiced efficiency, and Caleb had the delirious thought that this was the strangest way to see a woman's undergarments he'd ever experienced. "The bullet went through," Grace said, probing the exit wound with gentle fingers. "That's fortunate. But you're losing blood too quickly. I need to pack both wounds and bind them tight until we can get you to a real doctor." "Nearest doctor is Prescott," Caleb managed. 2 hours at least." "Then you'll have to survive for 2 hours," Grace said matter-of-factly. "I don't accept alternatives." Through the pain and blood loss, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in 8 years, the desire to live up to someone's expectations. Not just survive, which he'd been doing on autopilot, but actually fight to stay alive because someone cared whether he did or not. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Grace worked with quiet competence, packing the wounds with strips of her petticoat, binding them tight enough to slow the bleeding, but not so tight as to cut off circulation. Her touch was gentle despite the necessary firmness, and once she looked up to find Caleb watching her with an intensity that made her pause. "What?" she asked softly. "Trying to figure out why you care," Caleb said. "Don't know you. You don't know me." Grace's hand stilled for just a moment. "You put yourself between us and those outlaws without hesitation. You drew their fire to save strangers. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." "You'd be wrong," Caleb said, his voice rougher. "You don't know what I've done, who I've killed, the things I'm running from." "I know you're bleeding in a stagecoach because you chose to protect people you'd never met," Grace countered. "Whatever else you've done, whatever you're running from, that choice matters. Right now, that's what I'm choosing to see." Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to push her away with ugly truths about the men he'd killed and the violence that followed him like a shadow. But the coach hit another rough patch, and the jolt sent new waves of pain through his shoulder, stealing his breath and his words. "Easy," Grace murmured, one hand moving to steady his good shoulder. "We're almost to the tree line. Once we're in cover, I can do more." "The gang," Caleb started, "is falling back," Reverend Thomas reported from the window. "Looks like they're not willing to follow us into those trees. Maybe they think we've got reinforcements waiting. Or maybe they're just regrouping," Billy called down from the driver's box. "Either way, we've got maybe 10 minutes before they decide what to do next." Morrison pushed the team hard, and the coach rattled into the shelter of a cottonwood grove just as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The driver brought them to a halt in a small clearing where a spring bubbled up from between rocks, creating a pool of clear water that had probably saved the lives of travelers for centuries. "Everyone out," Morrison ordered. "Billy, you and the Reverend set up a perimeter. Watch for approach from the south. If you see dust, you holler." Grace helped Caleb out of the coach, supporting more of his weight than he wanted to admit. His legs felt like water, and the ground seemed to shift beneath his boots in ways that had nothing to do with the terrain and everything to do with blood loss. "Sit," Grace commanded, guiding him to a flat rock near the spring. "And for once in your life, do what you're told without argument." "Yes, ma'am," Caleb muttered, but he was too weak to put any real rebellion into it. Grace knelt beside him, wetting a clean piece of fabric in the spring water and carefully cleaning the blood from around his wounds. The cool water felt like heaven against his fevered skin, and Caleb found himself studying her face as she worked, the small furrow of concentration between her brows, the way she bit her lower lip slightly when focused, the gentle competence of hands that had clearly done this before. "New York draft riots," he said suddenly. "That was 1863. You would have been 17, Grace finished, and terrified. But my mother ran a charity clinic, and when the violence started, people needed help. Fear doesn't exempt you from responsibility. Most 17-year-old girls would have hidden in their rooms." Grace's smile was soft but carried an edge. "Most girls weren't raised by Elizabeth Alden. My mother believed that privilege carried obligation, that if you had skills or resources others lacked, you used them to help, not to isolate yourself." Caleb thought about his own isolation, the deliberate walls he'd built between himself and the world. Sometimes isolation is safer. "Safer for whom?" Grace asked, meeting his eyes directly. "For you or for the people you're afraid of caring about?" The question hit too close to the truth, and Caleb looked away, focusing on the spring, on the cottonwood leaves rustling in the evening breeze, on anything but the knowing compassion in her eyes. "I lost my wife," he said abruptly, the words escaping before he could stop them. 8 years ago, Cheyenne Raid. She was pregnant. 6 months. They killed her. Killed the baby. Killed everything that mattered." He'd never said it aloud before. Not like that. Not straight and simple and brutal. People in towns knew he was a widower. It was part of his reputation, part of the tragic figure of Caleb Rourke, the gunfighter with the dead eyes and the cold heart. But he'd never actually spoken the words, never made the loss real by giving it voice. Grace's hand stilled on the bandage she was checking. "I'm so sorry." Don't need your pity, Caleb said roughly. Good, because I'm not offering pity, Grace said. I'm offering understanding. Loss like that, it changes you, marks you, makes you afraid to ever feel that vulnerable again. Caleb looked at her sharply. You sound like you know. My fiancé died of typhoid 3 days before our wedding, Grace said quietly, finishing with the bandage and sitting back on her heels. 2 years ago. I thought my life was over. Thought I'd never recover from losing him, from losing the future we'd planned. But you did recover. Grace's smile was sad but genuine. I learned to live with the loss. Learned that grief doesn't mean you stop moving forward. It just means you carry something heavy while you walk. And eventually, you get stronger from carrying it. Caleb wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that the crushing weight he'd carried for 8 years might somehow make him stronger instead of just grinding him down to nothing. But belief was a luxury he'd lost along with everything else. The difference, he said slowly, is that you're still soft enough to care about strangers bleeding in stagecoaches. I stopped being soft a long time ago. Did you? Grace challenged. Because from where I'm sitting, you're a man who just took a bullet protecting people you'd never met. That doesn't sound hard to me. That sounds like someone who cares so much it scares him. Before Caleb could respond, before he could build another wall or push her away with harsh truths, Billy's voice rang out from the perimeter. Rider coming, just one, carrying a white flag. Morrison appeared with his rifle. Could be a trick. Could be, Caleb agreed, forcing himself to stand despite the way the world tilted. But Hadley's not stupid enough to try a frontal assault on a defended position. If he's sending someone to talk, we should hear what he has to say. You're in no condition, Grace started. I'm in perfect condition to handle this, Caleb cut her off, checking his Colt Peacemaker. 4 rounds left. He'd need to reload before any real trouble started, but 4 would do for a parley. The rider came into view through the cottonwoods, a lean man in his 30s with a pockmarked face and the nervous energy of someone who knew he was surrounded by people with reasons to shoot him. He kept his hands visible and his horse at a walk, the white handkerchief tied to his rifle barrel fluttering in the breeze. That's far enough, Morrison called when the man reached the clearing's edge. State your business. Name's Crenshaw, the rider said. I'm with Mr. Hadley's outfit. He sent me to deliver a message and an offer. We're listening, Caleb said, stepping forward. The movement sent pain lancing through his shoulder, but he kept his expression neutral. Crenshaw's eyes widened slightly when he saw Caleb. You're Caleb Rourke. Mr. Hadley said you might be. Said to tell you this is about what you did to his brother down in Colorado. His brother drew on me in a fair fight, Caleb said flatly. Wasn't my fault he was slow. Maybe so, but blood's blood, Crenshaw said. Mr. Hadley, he wants satisfaction. So here's the offer. You come out and face him one-on-one, and he lets the coach go free. Everyone else rides out of here alive and unmolested. You refuse, and we come in shooting. Might lose some men, but we'll get you eventually, and everyone else dies too. Silence fell across the clearing. Caleb could feel Grace's eyes on him, could sense her protest forming, but she surprised him by staying quiet, letting him make his own choice. How do I know Hadley keeps his word? Caleb asked. You don't, Crenshaw admitted. But I can tell you this. Mr. Hadley's a lot of things, but he's not a liar. He says he'll let them go if you face him. He means it. This is about you and him, about what you took from him. Rest of these folks are just in the way. Caleb felt the weight of the choice settling onto his shoulders, heavier than any wound. He could stay and fight, make them come through defensive positions, probably take several of them down before they overwhelmed the grove. But Billy would die. Morrison would die. The Reverend would die. And Grace would die trying to reload that Spencer carbine with hands that weren't quite steady enough for a real firefight. Or he could walk out there and face Jack Hadley one-on-one, knowing he was already weakened by blood loss, knowing his left arm was useless, knowing this was probably suicide. But the coach would go free. Grace would live. When had her survival become the factor that mattered most? Give me 5 minutes, Caleb said. I'll come out. Caleb, no! Grace stepped forward, her voice sharp with alarm. Mr. Rourke, that's insane, Morrison added. You can barely stand. You can't outdraw anyone like this. Maybe not, Caleb agreed. But it's better than getting all of you killed. There has to be another way, Grace insisted, her hand catching his good arm. We can defend this position. We can watch good people die, Caleb interrupted gently. I've seen it before, Grace. Seen what happens when you try to fight overwhelming odds from a fixed position. It's ugly and slow and everyone suffers. This way, at least you get to live. This way you die, Grace said bluntly. You're asking me to accept your death as the price of my survival. Do you really think I can do that? Caleb looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since she'd stepped out of that coach. Saw the strength in her eyes, the compassion that hadn't been broken by loss. The stubborn determination that made her reload a carbine in the face of outlaws rather than cower in a corner. Saw everything he'd once been before Sarah died. Before he'd let grief hollow him out and turn him into a walking ghost. I think you're going to have to, he said quietly, because I can't watch you die. Not when I can prevent it. Grace's eyes shimmered with tears she refused to let fall. You don't even know me. I know enough, Caleb said, and it was true. In the space of hours, she'd shown him more courage, more compassion, more life than he'd seen in years of drifting through towns where he knew no one and no one knew him. 5 minutes, Crenshaw called. Then we're coming in anyway. Caleb gently disengaged from Grace's grip and turned to Morrison. Soon as I'm clear of the grove, you run. Don't stop. Don't look back. Make Prescott and wire the marshal. Tell him the Hadley gang is operating out of Echo Canyon. Caleb? The driver started. That's not a request, Caleb said, with enough steel in his voice to brook no argument. Then he looked at Reverend Thomas. If I don't make it, I'd appreciate a prayer. Been a while since anyone bothered talking to God on my behalf. I'll pray for your victory, son, the Reverend said quietly. And for peace, whatever form it takes. Caleb nodded, checked his Colt one more time, and started toward the edge of the grove. Each step hurt, but pain was familiar, pain was honest. Pain reminded him he was still alive, at least for the next few minutes. Caleb, wait. Grace's voice stopped him. He turned, and she was there, close enough that he could smell lavender and gun smoke, could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Before he could say anything, before he could build another wall or push her away, she reached up and pulled his head down, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that tasted of desperation and defiance and something that might have been hope. It lasted 3 heartbeats. 4. Then she pulled back, her eyes fierce. You come back alive, Caleb Rourke, she said, or I'll never forgive you. Caleb touched his fingers to his lips, feeling the warmth she'd left there. Yes, ma'am, he said softly. Then he turned and walked toward his fate, trying not to think about the fact that for the first time in 8 years, he actually had something worth coming back for. The sun was touching the horizon when he emerged from the grove, painting the Wyoming plains in shades of amber and blood. Jack Hadley waited in the middle of the open ground, his hand resting casually near his gun, his smile cold as a knife blade. Caleb Rourke, Hadley called. Heard you were a man of honor underneath all that grief and rage. Glad to see the rumors were true. Your brother was a backshooter and a coward, Caleb said, walking forward slowly, deliberately. I gave him a fair chance, which is more than he deserved. He was my blood, Hadley said simply. And out here, blood's the only thing that matters. You understand that. You lost someone once. You know what it means to want revenge on the people who took them from you. Caleb stopped 20 paces away. His shoulder was screaming, and he could feel fresh blood soaking through Grace's careful bandages. The Colt felt heavier than it should in his hand, but his grip stayed steady. I know what it means to let rage poison everything good in your life, Caleb said. I know what it means to wake up one day and realize you've become exactly what you hated. That what you answer, Hadley? Behind him, he heard the coach starting to move. Good. Grace would live. That was enough. Draw whenever you're ready, Hadley said, his hand moving infinitesimally closer to his gun. Caleb didn't draw. Instead, he did something that surprised them both. He smiled. Not the cold smile of a killer, but something warmer. Something that felt almost human. You know what your mistake was, Hadley? Caleb asked. What's that? You gave me something to live for right before asking me to die. And then, Because life was strange and fate had a vicious sense of humor, three things happened simultaneously. A rifle shot cracked from the grove. Grace's Spencer, fired from concealment. The bullet took Hadley in the gun arm, spinning him sideways. And Caleb drew. The Colt bucked in his hand once, twice, 3 times. The first shot hit Hadley in the shoulder, payback in kind. The second and third dropped the 2 gang members who'd been hidden in the tall grass flanking the clearing. Insurance Hadley had bought against his own failure. Then Caleb's legs gave out, and he collapsed to one knee as the world grayed around the edges. He heard shouting, gunfire, the thunder of horses. Heard Morrison's voice yelling commands, Billy's shotgun booming, heard Grace screaming his name. Then there were hands on him, small, capable hands that smelled of lavender and gun smoke. Grace's face swam into view above him, her eyes fierce and terrified and blazing with life. "Don't you dare die on me," she said. "Not now. Not after that kiss." Caleb tried to smile, tried to tell her that she'd saved him in more ways than one. But the darkness was rising like a tide, and he let it take him, knowing that for the first time in 8 years, he might actually wake up with a reason to open his eyes. The last thing he heard before unconsciousness claimed him was Grace's voice, steady and sure. "I've got you, Caleb. I've got you." And for the first time since he'd buried his wife and unborn child in the cold ground of Colorado, Caleb Rourke believed that someone actually did. Consciousness returned in fragments. The creak of wagon wheels, the smell of wool blankets and antiseptic, pain that pulsed with each heartbeat through his shoulder. Caleb surfaced slowly from the darkness, his mind cataloging details before his eyes opened. Indoor air instead of the open plains, lamplight filtering through closed eyelids, voices speaking in hushed tones nearby. "His fever broke an hour ago," Grace's voice, tired but relieved. "The doctor said that's a good sign." "Fool man nearly got himself killed," Morrison's gruff response. "Pardon my language, Miss Alden, but walking out there wounded like that was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've ever seen." "Perhaps both," Grace said, and Caleb could hear the smile in her voice despite her exhaustion. "Though I'm inclined toward brave, given the circumstances." Caleb opened his eyes to find himself in a small room with whitewashed walls and lace curtains that caught the morning sun. A proper bed, not a bedroll on hard ground. Clean sheets that smelled of lavender soap. The ceiling was made of pressed tin painted white, and there was a watercolor painting of mountains on the wall opposite, the kind of gentle domesticity he hadn't experienced in 8 years. "You're awake," Grace said, and suddenly she was there beside the bed, her hand cool against his forehead. "Thank God. You've been unconscious for almost 18 hours. Caleb tried to speak, but his throat was desert dry. Grace anticipated his need, helping him sit up enough to sip water from a tin cup. The simple act of swallowing hurt, but the water was sweet and cold, and he drank gratefully. "Prescott?" he managed to rasp. "We made it," Grace confirmed, settling back into the chair beside his bed. She looked exhausted, her hair escaping from its pins, dark circles under her eyes, her traveling dress replaced by a simpler day dress in pale blue. But her eyes were bright with relief, and that stubborn strength he'd noticed from the beginning still radiated from her like heat from a stove. "Morrison drove through the night. The local doctor, Dr. Brennan, operated on your shoulder. He said another hour of blood loss and you wouldn't have made it. The gang scattered when Marshal Briggs and his deputies arrived at the grove. We'd sent Billy ahead on horseback to alert them. They captured Jack Hadley. Your shots wounded him badly enough that he couldn't run. The others are being tracked as we speak." Grace's expression hardened slightly. "Hadley will hang for the murder of those stage drivers last month. Your testimony will help ensure it." Caleb absorbed this information, trying to reconcile the fact that he was alive, in a real bed, being tended by a woman who looked at him like he mattered. It felt surreal, like a dream he'd wake from, to find himself back in some nameless hotel room, alone with his ghost. "You should have run," he said finally. "When I told you to run, you should have listened." Grace's eyebrow arched in that aristocratic expression he was beginning to recognize. "And let you face 7 armed outlaws alone while bleeding from a gunshot wound? I think not. You could have been killed. So could you. In fact, you nearly were." Grace leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "Do you really think I could have lived with myself if I'd run away and left you to die? What kind of person do you think I am? The kind who deserves to survive, Caleb said quietly. The kind the world needs more of. Not someone like me. Don't, Grace interrupted, her voice sharp enough to cut. Don't you dare diminish what you did, Caleb Rourke. You saved every person in that coach, including me. You drew fire, you made impossible shots while wounded, and you walked out to face certain death to give us a chance to live. That's not nothing. That's not worthless. That's heroism, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. Caleb looked away, uncomfortable with the praise, with the way her words made something in his chest tighten painfully. I just did what needed doing. No, you did far more than that. Grace's hand found his, the good one, resting on the blanket, and squeezed gently. And then I did what needed doing by making sure you survived it. We're even. You shot Hadley, Caleb said, remembering that crucial moment. That was a hell of a shot from concealment. Grace's smile turned slightly sheepish. My hands were shaking so badly, I'm amazed I hit him at all. I was aiming for his chest. Got his arm instead. Good enough, Caleb said, and felt his own lips curve into something that might have been a smile. You probably saved my life. Drew first blood before I had to. Then we saved each other, Grace said simply. A fair exchange. Before Caleb could respond, the door opened and a man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and the confident bearing of someone used to dealing with crisis entered. Dr. Brennan, Caleb assumed, based on the medical bag he carried and the way he immediately moved to check Caleb's pulse. Good. You're awake, the doctor said briskly. How's the pain? Scale of 1 to 10. 6, Caleb said, though it was closer to 8. No point in complaining about what couldn't be helped. Honest answer would be closer to 8 or 9, given your pallor and the way you're favoring that shoulder, Dr. Brennan said dryly, making notes in a small leather journal. I've seen men lie about pain before, Mr. Rourke. Usually the tough ones who think admitting discomfort is weakness. Let me be clear, lying to your doctor is stupidity, not strength. Despite himself, Caleb felt a flicker of respect for the man's directness. 8, then. Better. I'll give you laudanum for the worst of it, but sparingly. Don't want you developing a dependency. Dr. Brennan began unwrapping the bandages on Caleb's shoulder with practiced efficiency. You're lucky, relatively speaking. The bullet missed the major blood vessels and bone, tore through muscle and soft tissue, which will heal given time and rest. Emphasis on rest, Mr. Rourke. You try to get on a horse any time in the next 2 weeks, you'll tear everything open again and likely die of infection. 2 weeks? Caleb protested. I can't. You can and you will, Dr. Brennan interrupted. Unless you'd prefer to join your ancestors prematurely. Your choice, but I've stitched you up nicely, and I'd hate to see my work wasted because you're too stubborn to follow medical advice. Grace's hand tightened on Caleb's. He'll rest, she said firmly. I'll make sure of it. You're not my keeper, Caleb said, but there was no heat in it. Someone needs to be, Grace countered. Left to your own devices, you'd probably be back on that horse tomorrow, bleeding through your stitches and wondering why the world was getting dark around the edges. Dr. Brennan chuckled as he applied fresh bandages. I like her, Rourke. Woman with sense. You should listen to her. After examining the wound thoroughly and declaring himself satisfied with how it was healing, Dr. Brennan packed up his bag and headed for the door. I'll check on you again this evening. Miss Alden has my instructions for care. Keeping the wound clean, watching for signs of infection, managing pain. You're in capable hands. When the doctor left, silence settled over the room, broken only by the distant sounds of Prescott coming to life outside. Merchants opening shops, horses clopping past, the rhythmic hammer of a blacksmith at work. Normal sounds. Life continuing as it always did, indifferent to the violence that had brought Caleb here. Where am I exactly? Caleb asked, looking around the room again. Mrs. Henshaw's boarding house, Grace explained. Respectable establishment, clean rooms, reasonable rates. The doctor arranged for you to stay here during your recovery. Can't afford 2 weeks in a boarding house, Caleb said bluntly. The violence of his profession paid well enough, but he'd never been good at saving money. What was the point when you had nothing to save for? It's covered, Grace said quickly. Too quickly. Caleb's eyes narrowed. By who? Grace's chin lifted slightly, that stubborn determination manifesting in the set of her jaw. by me. Consider it payment for saving my life. I don't want your charity. It's not charity, it's commerce. A fair exchange of services rendered. Grace's voice remained calm, but steel underlay the politeness. You saved my life multiple times. The least I can do is ensure you recover properly from the wounds you sustained in doing so, unless your pride is so fragile that accepting help threatens it. The barb hit home, and Caleb had to acknowledge the truth of it. When had he become so isolated that accepting basic human kindness felt like weakness? When had the walls he'd built grown so high that he couldn't see over them anymore? Thank you, he said finally, the words rusty from disuse. For this, for taking care of me, for not running when I told you to. Grace's expression softened. You're welcome. For all of it. A knock at the door interrupted the moment, and Morrison entered with his hat in his hands, looking uncomfortable in the way men did when visiting the sick room. Rourke, glad to see you're still with us. Takes more than one bullet to kill me, Caleb said, attempting levity he didn't quite feel. Apparently so. Morrison shifted his weight. I wanted to thank you proper-like for what you did. Drawing that gang off, facing Hadley, that was above and beyond what we hired you for. The stage lines authorized a bonus for hazard pay, $100 on top of your standard fee. $100. More money than Caleb usually saw in 3 months of drifting between jobs. Enough to buy him time to heal without worrying about the boarding house costs, with plenty left over. That's generous, Caleb said carefully. It's deserved, Morrison corrected. You saved lives, Rourke, mine included, Billy's, the Reverend's, Miss Alden's. He glanced at Grace, his weathered face creasing into something that might have been a smile. Speaking of which, this young lady here didn't leave your side the whole ride to Prescott. Held pressure on your wounds, kept you from bleeding out, talked to you the whole way even though you were unconscious. Doctor said her quick thinking probably saved your life before we even got you to him. Caleb looked at Grace, who had the grace to blush slightly. I only did what anyone would do. No, ma'am, begging your pardon, but that's not true, Morrison said firmly. Most folks would have panicked or frozen up. You kept your head, stayed calm, did what needed doing. That takes character. Mr. Rourke's lucky to have had you there. After Morrison left, promising to check in again before he headed back east, Caleb studied Grace with new eyes. This woman who'd boarded the stage in her fine traveling dress, who'd seemed so out of place in the harsh Wyoming territory, had spent hours keeping him alive through sheer determination and skill, had refused to run when wisdom dictated retreat, had fired a shot that likely saved his life even though her hands were shaking. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. Stay with me. You just met me. I was nothing to you. Grace met his gaze steadily. You became something the moment you put yourself between me and those outlaws. And you became something more when you walked out to face Hadley knowing you'd probably die. People like you, who give everything for strangers, are rare, Caleb, worth saving, worth fighting for. I'm not a good man, Grace. The words came out rough, scraped raw by years of self-recrimination. The things I've done, the men I've killed... Were they fair fights? Grace interrupted. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. Always. I never backshot anyone, never drew on someone who didn't draw first. Then you operated by a code, even in violence. That's not the same as being a bad man. That's being a man trying to survive in a hard world with what honor you can maintain. Grace leaned forward, her eyes searching his face. Tell me something, Caleb. In 8 years of drifting, have you ever killed someone who didn't deserve it? Ever hurt someone innocent? No, Caleb admitted. Then stop carrying guilt that isn't yours to carry. The world made you hard. Loss made you lonely, but neither of those things made you evil. Caleb wanted to believe her. Wanted to believe that the slate could be wiped clean, that the violence he'd lived with for so long didn't define him completely. But belief was difficult when you'd spent 8 years convinced you deserved nothing better than solitude and the next bullet with your name on it. Why do you care? He asked, the question raw and honest. Really? Why does it matter to you whether I think I'm worth saving? Grace was quiet for a long moment, her fingers still resting lightly on his hand. When she spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability that matched his own. Because when my fiancé died, I wanted to die too. Wanted to just stop existing because the pain was too much and the future was too empty. And everyone around me kept telling me to be strong, to move on, to let go and live again. But no one told me it was okay to hurt. No one told me that surviving didn't mean I had to pretend the loss didn't matter. She paused, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You hurt, Caleb. I can see it in every guarded look, every wall you build, every time you flinch away from connection. You're still carrying your wife and child like open wounds, and you think that makes you weak, but it doesn't. It makes you human. And I care because I see in you the man I might have become if I'd let grief turn me bitter instead of just sad. The honesty of it struck Caleb like a physical blow. Here was someone who understood not just the fact of loss, but the texture of it, the way it changed everything about how you move through the world. Someone who'd faced the same abyss he'd been staring into for 8 years and had somehow found a way to keep walking without letting it consume her. How did you do it? He asked quietly. How did you keep living without letting the grief poison everything? Grace's smile was sad but genuine. I didn't, at first. For 6 months, I was angry at everyone who was alive while Thomas was dead. Angry at God. Angry at the world. Angry at myself for not being sick too. I withdrew from everyone, stopped attending functions, stopped caring about anything. What changed? My mother sat me down one day and asked me a question. She said, Grace, if you could go back and never meet Thomas, never fall in love with him, never experience the joy of those years together, if you could erase it all and spare yourself this pain, would you? Grace's voice roughened slightly. And I realized the answer was no. That even with the agony of losing him, I wouldn't trade the happiness we'd had, that the love was worth the grief. Caleb felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the ice that had encased his heart for so long. Because the truth was, if someone offered to erase Sarah and the child from his memory to spare him the pain of their loss, he wouldn't take that bargain. The years with Sarah had been the best of his life. The anticipation of their child had filled him with a joy he'd never experienced before or since. And yes, losing them had nearly destroyed him, but the love itself, that had been real and good and worth having. I wouldn't trade it either, he said, the admission feeling like a confession. Wouldn't erase Sarah or the baby. Wouldn't give up those years even to stop the hurt. Then you haven't lost everything, Grace said gently. You still have the love, the memories, the knowledge that you were capable of that depth of feeling. Loss takes the person, Caleb, but it can't take what you shared unless you let it. They sat in silence for a while, the morning sun climbing higher, filling the room with golden light. Outside, Prescott continued its daily rhythm, indifferent to the small revolution happening in this boarding house room where a broken man was starting to remember what it meant to be whole. You should rest, Grace said eventually, though she made no move to leave. Dr. Brennan said sleep is crucial for healing. You should rest too, Caleb countered, noting the exhaustion in the lines around her eyes. You look like you haven't slept since the attack. I haven't, Grace admitted. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw you bleeding, saw Hadley drawing his gun, saw everything that could have gone wrong. But didn't, Caleb reminded her. We're both here, both alive. That's what matters. Grace smiled, a real smile that transformed her tired face into something radiant. When did you become the optimist in this conversation? Might have something to do with the company I'm keeping, Caleb said, and was rewarded by the slight blush that colored her cheeks. She stood, smoothing her skirts, but before she could move toward the door, Caleb caught her hand. Grace, that kiss. Before I went out to face Hadley. Was that just... Did you only do that because you thought I was going to die? Grace looked down at their joined hands, then back up at his face, her expression open and honest. I kissed you because I wanted you to have something to come back for. Because in the space of a few hours, you'd shown me more courage and compassion and raw humanity than most men show in a lifetime. Because when you looked at me, you saw past the finishing school manners and the banker's daughter and just saw me. And because... She paused, gathering courage. Because I haven't felt this alive, this present, this aware of another person since Thomas died. And it terrified me and exhilarated me in equal measure. Caleb's heart was doing strange things in his chest, beating in rhythms he'd forgotten existed. I haven't felt anything but numb for 8 years, until you fell asleep on my shoulder during the ride. That simple trust, it cracked something open inside me that I thought was sealed forever. The ride? Grace looked confused. But I never... Oh, understanding dawned in her eyes. In the coach, after the first shots. I was so exhausted from the journey and the adrenaline crash, and you were just there, solid and safe. I must have dozed against you for a few minutes before the ambush. 5 minutes, Caleb said. But it felt like everything. Like someone still trusted me enough to be vulnerable in my presence. Like maybe I wasn't completely broken after all. Grace squeezed his hand gently. You're not broken, Caleb. You're wounded. There's a difference. Broken things can't heal. Wounded things can, given time and care and the right person to help with the bandaging. Is that what you're doing? Helping with the bandaging? Among other things, Grace said, and there was something in her smile that made Caleb's breath catch. Now rest. When you wake up, I'll bring you some of Mrs. Henshaw's chicken soup. It won't compare to restaurant fare, but it's hearty and will help you regain your strength. She started to pull away, but Caleb held on for just a moment longer. Grace, thank you for everything, for not giving up on me even when I'd given up on myself. Someone wise once told me that people like you, who give everything for strangers, are worth fighting for, Grace said softly. I'm just returning the favor. After she left, Caleb lay back against the pillows, exhaustion pulling at him despite the hours he'd already spent unconscious. But for the first time in 8 years, sleep didn't feel like escape. It felt like healing, like the first step towards something he'd thought was lost forever, the possibility of a future that held more than just survival. He woke in the late afternoon to find Grace sitting by the window, reading a leather-bound book with concentration. The light caught her profile, illuminating the elegant line of her jaw, the slight furrow of concentration between her brows. She'd changed into a fresh dress, dark green this time, and had repinned her hair, though a few rebellious strands still escaped to frame her face. What are you reading? Caleb asked, his voice still rough from sleep. Grace looked up, smiling when she saw he was awake. Whitman, Leaves of Grass. Have you read it? Can't say I have. Poetry's not usually my area. It should be, Grace said, closing the book but keeping her finger marking the page. Whitman writes about America as it really is, raw and beautiful and contradictory, about death and life and the connection between all things. Listen to this. She opened the book again, finding her place, and read aloud. I do not ask the wounded person how he feels. I myself become the wounded person. The words hung in the air between them, resonating with everything that had passed between them over the past day and a half. Caleb felt the truth of it. The way Grace had taken his pain into herself, had refused to let him suffer alone, had somehow become wounded alongside him in the sharing of their stories. He understood, Caleb said quietly, about how pain connects people. He understood a lot of things, Grace agreed, about how we're all struggling through this life together, how isolation is a kind of death, how love and loss are two sides of the same coin. She paused, then added, he also understood that healing often comes from unexpected places, that sometimes the people we meet by chance become the ones who change everything. Is that what this is? Caleb asked. You and me. Chance? Grace considered the question seriously. I used to believe everything happened for a reason, that God had a plan and we were all moving according to his design. Then Thomas died 3 days before our wedding, and I couldn't reconcile a loving God with that kind of arbitrary cruelty. So I stopped believing in divine plans. But sometimes I wonder if maybe it's not about grand design. Maybe it's about moments, about choices, about two people meeting at exactly the right time to save each other in ways that have nothing to do with fate and everything to do with recognition. Recognition of what? Grace's eyes met his, dark and honest. Of kindred spirits, of shared wounds, of the potential for healing that exists when two broken people decide to be broken together instead of alone. Before Caleb could respond, voices rose from downstairs, male voices, authoritative and official. Boots on the stairs, heavy and purposeful. Then a knock at the door. Mr. Rourke, It's Marshall Briggs. Need to speak with you if you're able. Grace opened the door to admit a man in his late 40s with a silver star pinned to his vest and the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades enforcing law in a territory that sometimes seemed allergic to it. Behind him stood two deputies, younger men with alert eyes and ready hands near their weapons. Marshall, Caleb acknowledged, trying to sit up straighter and immediately regretting it as pain lanced through his shoulder. Easy there, Briggs said, moving into the room with the confidence of long authority. Doc Brennan said you're still healing. This won't take long. Just need your statement about what happened with the Hadley gang. For the next 20 minutes, Caleb recounted the attack, the ambush in Echo Canyon, the running fight, Hadley's ultimatum, the final confrontation. Grace added her perspective, her voice steady as she described firing the shot that wounded Hadley, giving Caleb the opening he needed. Briggs took notes in a worn leather journal, his expression growing grimmer as the story unfolded. You're lucky to be alive, both of you. Hadley's gang has been terrorizing this territory for 2 years. We've lost good men trying to bring them in. How many did you capture? Caleb asked. 4, including Hadley himself. He's in bad shape from your shooting, but he'll live long enough to hang. The others scattered, but we've got posies tracking them. Briggs fixed Caleb with a sharp look. There's a reward, you know, $500 for Hadley, dead or alive. Another $200 for the others. You're entitled to the full amount, given that you're the one who brought him down. $700. A fortune by any measure. Enough to buy land, start over, build something permanent instead of just drifting. The thought should have excited him, but all Caleb could think was that blood money felt heavier than it used to. Hadley might have been an outlaw and a murderer, but he'd also been a brother seeking revenge for his sibling's death. The moral lines that used to seem so clear were blurring in ways that made Caleb uncomfortable. Split it, he said abruptly. Between Morrison, Billy, and the Reverend, they all risked their lives. Briggs raised an eyebrow. That's generous of you. Most men would keep reward money that size. Most men didn't have a woman save their life by shooting the outlaw first, Caleb said, glancing at Grace. She should get a share too. Absolutely not, Grace protested. I don't want money for that. Then consider it payment for nursing services, Caleb countered, for keeping me alive on the ride to Prescott, for staying by my side, for doing what any decent person would do, Grace interrupted firmly. I don't need payment for basic human compassion, Caleb. Marshall Briggs watched this exchange with interest, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. If you two are done arguing about who's more noble, I'll leave the reward distribution to you, Rourke. You earned it. You decide how it's split. He tipped his hat to Grace. Ma'am, you've got courage. Not many women would have stood their ground against the Hadley gang. After the marshal and his deputies left, silence settled over the room again. Outside, the afternoon was fading into evening, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. You really would have given away $700, Grace said, wonder in her voice. Money doesn't mean much when you've got nothing to spend it on, Caleb said. Those men have families, lives, futures. They can use it better than I can. Had nothing to spend it on, Grace corrected gently. Past tense. But maybe that's changing. Caleb met her eyes, saw the question and the hope there, and felt something in his chest unfurl like a flower after rain. Maybe it is, he admitted, though I'm not sure what that looks like. Haven't thought about a future in so long, I'm not sure I remember how. It starts small, Grace said, moving back to her chair by his bedside. With soup and rest and conversation, with healing, both physical and otherwise. With letting yourself imagine tomorrow without assuming it will be the same as yesterday. And after tomorrow? Grace's smile was soft but carried an edge of steel that Caleb was learning to recognize as her particular blend of gentleness and determination. After tomorrow, we see what the day after brings. And the one after that. One day at a time, until suddenly you realize you've built a week, then a month, then a life. Mrs. Henshaw appeared at the door with a tray bearing the promised chicken soup, warm bread, and tea. She was a stout woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the no-nonsense manner of someone who'd seen it all and wasn't impressed by much. Glad to see you're awake and talking, Mr. Rourke, she said, setting the tray on the small table by the window. Miss Alden's been worried sick, though she's too polite to say so. Barely left this room except to change clothes and take meals. Mrs. Henshaw, Grace protested, blushing. No point being shy about it, dear, Mrs. Henshaw said briskly. Man deserves to know he's got someone who cares whether he lives or dies. Lord knows enough people drift through this territory without anyone giving a damn. She fixed Caleb with a stern look. You've got something precious in this young lady's concern. I hope you're wise enough to appreciate it. I'm starting to be, Caleb said quietly, his eyes on Grace. Mrs. Henshaw harumphed with satisfaction and headed for the door. Soup while it's hot, Mr. Rourke. And Miss Alden, you'll join me for supper downstairs in an hour. You need proper food in you, not just tea and worry. After she left, Grace helped Caleb sit up enough to eat, propping pillows behind him with gentle efficiency. The soup was indeed hearty, rich with chicken and vegetables, seasoned with herbs that reminded him of home, of Sarah's cooking, of a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. What are you thinking? Grace asked, watching his face. That I haven't had food that tasted like this in 8 years, Caleb admitted. Haven't let myself have anything that felt like comfort or home. Felt like I didn't deserve it. And now? Caleb ate another spoonful, letting the warmth spread through him. Now I'm wondering if maybe I've been punishing myself for surviving when they didn't. If maybe all this isolation was just a slow way of dying without having the courage to pull the trigger. Grace's hand covered his, her touch warm and grounding. Grief can be a kind of suicide, death by inches instead of moments. But you're still here, Caleb, still breathing, still capable of feeling, even if you've spent years trying not to. That means it's not too late to choose life instead of just existence. They ate in companionable silence, the soup slowly filling the hollow places inside Caleb that had nothing to do with hunger. When he'd finished, Grace helped him lie back down, adjusting the pillows, checking his bandages with the practiced care that spoke of her experience nursing the wounded during the draft riots. Grace, Caleb said as she moved to collect the dishes, when you're done helping your father set up the bank branch here, what happens then? Do you go back east? Grace paused, her back to him, her hand still on the tray. When she turned, her expression was vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before. I don't know. My father wants me to return to Philadelphia. Says this territory is too rough for a woman of my background. But I've never felt more alive than I have these past 2 days. Never felt more useful, more present, more like myself. Back east, I'm always performing, the dutiful daughter, the proper lady, the widow who's expected to mourn decorously and then fade into genteel spinsterhood. Here, I'm just Grace. And I'm starting to think that's worth more than all the drawing rooms and society functions in the world. Caleb's heart was doing those strange rhythms again, hope and fear tangling together in his chest. If you stayed, would it be for the territory or... Grace set the tray down and came back to his bedside, her eyes searching his face. It would be for the possibility of finding out what this is between us. Whatever changed when you drew fire to protect me, when I fell asleep against your shoulder, when we both chose to fight instead of run. I don't know what to call it yet, but I know I'm not ready to walk away from it. I'm not an easy man, Grace, Caleb said, needing her to understand. I'm hard and scarred, and I've got demons that don't sleep quiet. You deserve better than someone who spent 8 years proving he doesn't know how to live. I'm not looking for easy, Grace said firmly. I'm looking for real, for honest, for someone who understands that healing isn't linear and grief doesn't have an expiration date, for someone who sees me as a person instead of a prize or a problem. She paused, then added softly, for someone who makes me want to be brave enough to try again. Caleb reached up with his good hand, cupping her cheek, feeling her lean into the touch. You scare the hell out of me, he admitted, because you make me want things I thought were dead. Make me hope when hope's been a stranger for so long I barely recognize it. Good, Grace said, covering his hand with hers. Because you terrify me too. But I'm learning that the best things in life are usually the ones that scare us most. The evening deepened into night, and Grace stayed by his side, reading Whitman aloud until Caleb's eyes grew heavy. Her voice was soothing, rising and falling with the rhythm of the poetry. And for the first time in 8 years, Caleb fell asleep not to escape, but simply because he was tired, because healing demanded rest, because tomorrow was coming and he was starting to believe he might want to be there to see it. When he woke deep in the night, Grace was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, the book of poetry fallen open in her lap. Caleb watched her in the moonlight streaming through the window, this woman who'd refused to run when wisdom dictated retreat, who'd shot an outlaw to save his life, who'd stayed by his side through fever and pain and the slow work of healing. And he realized, with the mixture of terror and wonder, that somewhere between Echo Canyon and this boarding house room, between a bullet in his shoulder and soup that tasted like home, he'd started falling in love again. The realization sat in Caleb's chest like a living thing, equal parts warmth and terror, as he watched Grace sleep in the moonlight. Love. The word felt foreign after 8 years of carefully constructed numbness, yet undeniable in its truth. He thought that part of him had died with Sarah and their unborn child, buried so deep that resurrection was impossible. But here it was, fragile and new and utterly terrifying, growing in the spaces Grace had opened with her stubborn refusal to let him die alone. He must have made some sound because Grace stirred, her eyes opening slowly. For a moment she looked disoriented. Then her gaze focused on him and she sat up straighter, wincing at the stiffness in her neck. "You should be in a proper bed," Caleb said quietly, not wanting to wake the rest of the house. "I'm fine," Grace whispered back, but she rolled her shoulders with a grimace that suggested otherwise. "Liar." Caleb shifted carefully, making room on the edge of the bed. "At least sit somewhere that won't leave you crippled. Doctors got me healing. No point in you falling apart from keeping watch." Grace hesitated, propriety warring with practicality in her expression. Then she moved to perch on the very edge of the mattress, maintaining a careful distance that somehow felt more intimate than touching would have been. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Slept most of the day. Body's confused about what time it is." Caleb watched her profile in the silver light. "What about you? You should be exhausted." "I am," Grace admitted. "But every time I close my eyes properly, I see that moment in the canyon when you rode straight at them. See the bullet hit you. See you falling." Her voice caught slightly. "I keep thinking about all the ways it could have ended differently. All the ways I might have lost you before I even knew I'd found you." The honesty of it made Caleb's throat tight. "I'm here. We both are. That's what matters." "Is it?" Grace turned to look at him, her eyes dark and serious. "Because in a few days you'll be healed enough to leave, to go back to drifting between towns, taking jobs that might get you killed. And I'll be here helping my father establish a bank, pretending that these 2 days didn't change everything about how I see the world. Is that what you want? To pretend nothing happened?" "No," Grace said fiercely. "But I don't know what the alternative is. I can't ask you to stay. Can't ask you to give up the life you know for a possibility that might not work. That wouldn't be fair." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over in his mind. A week ago, the idea of staying anywhere would have been impossible. He'd spent 8 years running from permanence, from connection, from anything that might root him long enough to feel the full weight of his grief. But Grace had shown him something he'd forgotten, that grief didn't have to mean the end of everything, that carrying loss didn't require destroying the possibility of finding something new. "What if I wanted to stay?" he asked carefully. "Not because you asked, but because I chose it. Because for the first time in 8 years, staying somewhere sounds less terrifying than leaving." Grace's breath caught. "You'd do that? Give up drifting?" "I've been running for 8 years, Grace. From myself, from memories, from the possibility that I might survive after all. And where has it gotten me? Alone in nameless hotel rooms, taking jobs that might kill me because I don't care enough about tomorrow to worry about whether I see it." Caleb reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "You make me care. About tomorrow. About next week. About building something instead of just surviving until the next bullet finds me." "That's not a small thing," Grace warned. "Staying means facing everything you've been running from. Means letting people know you well enough to care about you. Means being vulnerable in ways that might hurt worse than any wound." "I know." Caleb squeezed her hand gently. "Scares the hell out of me. But so does the thought of watching you ride out of my life. So I guess I'm choosing the fear that comes with possibility over the fear that comes with guaranteed loneliness." Grace's eyes shimmered with tears that caught the moonlight. "What if it doesn't work? What if we try and fail?" "Then at least we tried," Caleb said. "At least we didn't let fear make our choices for us." You told me grief doesn't have to poison everything. Maybe fear doesn't either. Grace leaned forward, resting her forehead against his, their breath mingling in the small space between them. I'm terrified, she whispered. Me too, Caleb admitted, but I'd rather be terrified with you than numb without you. She kissed him then, soft and sweet and tentative, nothing like the desperate press of lips before he'd walked out to face Hadley. This was different. A promise instead of a farewell. A beginning instead of an ending. Caleb kissed her back with his good arm coming up to pull her closer, careful of his wounded shoulder, and felt something in his chest crack open fully, letting in light for the first time in years. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing harder, Grace's cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright. We should stop, she said, but made no move to leave. Probably, Caleb agreed, but his hand was tangled in her hair, and he could feel her pulse racing beneath his thumb where it rested against her throat. Mrs. Henshaw would have opinions about propriety, Grace added, a smile tugging at her lips. Mrs. Henshaw's asleep. Dr. Brennan said you need rest to heal. I am resting. Caleb's smile was slow and genuine, the first real smile he'd given anyone in longer than he could remember. Very restfully, with you. Grace laughed softly, the sound like music in the quiet room. Your trouble, Caleb Rourke. You're just figuring that out now? She kissed him again, longer this time, with more confidence, and Caleb felt years of ice melting away under the warmth of her touch. When she finally pulled back, she settled more comfortably against his good side, her head on his shoulder, careful not to jostle his wound. Tell me about her, Grace said quietly. About Sarah, if you want to. Caleb stiffened slightly, old instincts rising to deflect the question. But Grace's steady breathing against his side, the weight of her trust, made him want to try, made him want to give her the truth instead of the walls he'd built from it. She was a school teacher, he began slowly. Met her in Denver when I was working cattle drives. She had this laugh, loud and completely unself-conscious, used to embarrass her mother at church socials. The memory made him smile despite the ache. She loved books and terrible singing and baking pies that never quite turned out right. And she saw something in me worth loving, even when I was too young and stupid to deserve it. How long were you married? 3 years. Best 3 years of my life. Caleb's voice roughened. When she got pregnant, I thought I had everything. Thought I'd figured out what it all meant, work and love and building a life that mattered. Then the raid came, and in 10 minutes, everything I'd built was ash. Grace's hand found his, squeezing gently. I'm sorry. That's not enough. But I'm sorry. The worst part, Caleb continued, the words coming easier now that he'd started, was that I wasn't there. I was 2 days out on a cattle drive. Came home to find the cabin burned, Sarah and the baby both gone. If I'd been there, you'd be dead too, Grace interrupted gently. And the world would have lost you 8 years earlier. That wouldn't have saved them, Caleb. It would have just meant 3 deaths instead of 2. Doesn't stop the guilt. No, Grace agreed. Guilt doesn't need logic to survive. But you can't build a life on what-ifs and should-have-beens. Trust me, I tried. I spent 6 months after Thomas died replaying every conversation, every decision, wondering if I could have saved him if I'd just noticed he was getting sick sooner, if I'd called the doctor faster, if I'd prayed harder. She paused, her voice thick with old pain. But I couldn't have. He was already dying, and nothing I did or didn't do would have changed that. Accepting that truth was the hardest thing I've ever done. How did you accept it? My mother made me write it all down. Every regret, every what-if, every moment of guilt. Pages and pages of it. Then she made me read it aloud to her. Grace's voice was barely a whisper now. And when I was done, she asked me if any of it would bring Thomas back. When I said no, she told me to burn it, to literally set fire to all that guilt and watch it turn to ash. Said I could carry his memory or carry the weight of imagined failures, but I couldn't carry both and still have hands free to build a future. So you burned it. Not right away. It took me 2 more weeks before I could let it go, but eventually I did. Stood in the garden and watched all those pages burn and felt something lift. Grace shifted slightly, looking up at him. The guilt doesn't disappear completely. still visits sometimes, usually at 3 in the morning when I can't sleep. But it doesn't own me anymore. Doesn't define everything I am. Caleb absorbed this, imagining his own pages of guilt and regret, all the what-ifs he'd carried for 8 years. The thought of burning them, of letting them go, was both terrifying and oddly liberating. Maybe Grace was right. Maybe he could carry Sarah's memory without carrying the crushing weight of survivor's guilt. Maybe they weren't the same thing after all. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for telling me that, for not letting me hide behind the walls." "We're both hiding behind walls," Grace said. "I just happen to be better at making mine look like windows." They talked through the night, trading stories in the darkness like children sharing secrets. Grace told him about growing up in Philadelphia, about her mother's charity work and her father's careful navigation of banking politics, about the draft riots and the terror of treating wounded men while mobs raged outside, about Thomas and their plans for a quiet life in Boston, teaching and raising children and growing old together. Caleb told her about his childhood in Missouri, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about his father's death in the border wars and his mother's quiet grief that eventually consumed her, about the years of cattle drives and the freedom of open country, about finding Sarah and discovering that home was a person, not a place. By the time dawn painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, they knew each other in ways that went beyond facts and into understanding. The kind of knowing that came from sharing wounds and hopes and the fragile possibility of healing. Grace fell asleep against his shoulder as the sun rose, her breathing deep and even, completely trusting. And Caleb, who hadn't protected anyone in 8 years, felt the fierce determination to keep this woman safe settle into his bones like a vow. The next 5 days passed in a strange suspension of time, the world narrowing to the boarding house room and the slow work of healing. Dr. Brennan visited daily, expressing satisfaction with how Caleb's wound was closing, warning against too much movement too soon. Grace spent her mornings helping her father with bank preparations, and her afternoons and evenings at Caleb's side, reading aloud, playing cards, and filling the room with conversation that felt as necessary as breathing. On the 6th day, Caleb was finally allowed to walk around the room without assistance. The movement hurt, pulled at stitches, and reminded him he wasn't fully healed, but it also felt like reclaiming himself, like proving he was more than just a patient in a bed. "You're pushing too hard," Grace said from her chair by the window, watching him pace with concern in her eyes. "I'm fine," Caleb insisted, though sweat beaded on his forehead from the effort. "You're stubborn," Grace corrected. "There's a difference," says the woman who shot an outlaw to save a stranger. "You weren't a stranger anymore by then." Grace set down her book and crossed to him, pressing her hand to his forehead to check for fever. "You'd already become something more." Caleb caught her hand, holding it against his cheek. "What had I become?" "Someone I couldn't imagine losing," Grace said simply, and the honesty of it made his chest tight. Before he could respond, urgent footsteps thundered up the stairs, and Morrison burst through the door without knocking, his face flushed and his expression grim. "We've got trouble," the driver said without preamble. "3 of the Hadley gang broke out of the jail last night, killed a deputy in the process. Marshal Briggs thinks they're coming here." Caleb felt his blood turn to ice. "Why here?" "Because word got out that you're the one who brought down Jack Hadley. Because his brother Seth is one of the ones who escaped, and he's swearing vengeance." Morrison's jaw was tight. "Marshall's setting up protection, but I thought you should know. Thought you might want to get Miss Alden somewhere safe." Grace's face had gone pale, but her voice stayed steady. "Where would be safer than a town with a marshal and deputies?" "Anywhere these men aren't looking," Morrison said bluntly. "They're desperate and angry, and they've got nothing to lose. That makes them unpredictable." Caleb's mind was already working through possibilities, tactical considerations, the mathematics of defense and escape. He was in no condition to fight. His shoulder was still healing, his strength not fully returned. But Grace was here, in danger because of choices he'd made, because he'd stood between her and outlaws in that canyon. "When did they escape?" he asked, forcing himself to think clearly despite the fear clawing at his throat. "Sometime after midnight. They were discovered missing at dawn." Morrison checked his pocket watch. "That gives them maybe 6 hours to get organized and plan their approach. Marshall thinks they'll hit before nightfall, while they can still see their targets. That gives us maybe 2 hours then. Caleb looked at Grace. You need to leave. Now. Morrison can take you. No, Grace interrupted, her chin lifting in that stubborn way he'd come to know. I'm not running and leaving you here wounded and alone. Grace, these men are killers. I know what they are. I also know you can barely lift your left arm, that you're still healing, that you need someone watching your back. Her eyes blazed with determination. I didn't shoot Jack Hadley just to let his brother finish what he started. We fight this together or not at all. She's got a point, Morrison said reluctantly. You're not in any shape to handle 3 men alone. And Miss Alden's proven she can shoot when it matters. Caleb wanted to argue, wanted to wrap Grace up and send her somewhere far from the violence that followed him like a shadow. But he also knew that stubborn set to her jaw, knew she wouldn't run even if he begged. And maybe fighting together was better than fighting alone. Maybe that was the whole point of everything that had passed between them. All right, he said finally, but we do this smart, defensively. We don't go looking for trouble. We let it come to us on our terms. Morrison nodded approval. I'll inform the marshal you're staying put. He'll want to coordinate defense. This boarding house is solid construction, good sight lines, defensible positions. Could work in our favor. After Morrison left to rally the marshal, Caleb and Grace looked at each other in the sudden silence. The morning sunlight streaming through the window seemed obscenely cheerful given the threat hanging over them. You should have run, Caleb said quietly. So should you, 6 days ago, Grace countered. But neither of us is very good at the sensible choice, apparently. Grace, if something happens to you because of me... She crossed to him, placing her fingers against his lips to stop the words. Nothing is going to happen to me, or to you. We're going to face this the way we've faced everything else, together. And we're going to survive it. Her voice softened. I didn't find you just to lose you to your brother's revenge. Caleb pulled her close with his good arm, breathing in the scent of her hair, trying to memorize the feel of her against him in case this was the last time. I love you, he said, the words escaping before he could stop them, raw and honest. Didn't think I'd ever say that to anyone again, but it's true. I love you, Grace Alden. Grace pulled back enough to see his face, her eyes wide and shining with tears. I love you too, and that's why we're both going to survive this, because I refuse to lose someone I love twice in one lifetime. She kissed him fiercely, desperately, and Caleb kissed her back with everything he had, trying to pour 8 years of isolation and newfound hope into the press of lips and the tangle of breath. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard, and Caleb felt more alive than he had in years, terrified and hopeful and utterly determined to see tomorrow. Marshal Briggs arrived 20 minutes later with 3 deputies and a plan. They'd fortify the boarding house, position shooters at key windows, set up crossfire angles that would make any approach costly. Mrs. Henshaw was less than pleased about turning her establishment into a fortress, but she understood necessity when she saw it. Other guests are being evacuated, Briggs explained, studying the street from the second-floor window. We'll leave just you, Miss Alden, and my men. Anyone approaches who isn't known to us, we challenge them. They don't respond properly, we shoot. You think they'll come straight at us? Caleb asked, checking his Colt and wishing his shoulder would cooperate enough to handle a rifle properly. Seth Hadley's not subtle. Lost his brother to what he sees as betrayal, lost Jack to your guns. He's running on rage and revenge, not strategy. Briggs spat tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. That makes him dangerous but predictable. He'll come hard and fast, probably with whatever men he could rally. Won't be patient enough for a siege. Then we need to be ready for a frontal assault. Caleb thought through the approaches. Main Street gives them cover from the storefronts across the way. They could get within 50 yards before we'd have clean shots. That's why I've got Billy positioned on the roof of the general store, Briggs said, pointing to the building across the street. High ground, clear sight lines down Main Street. He sees them coming, he fires a warning shot, and we all take positions. Grace appeared in the doorway with her Spencer carbine and a bandolier of ammunition that she'd somehow acquired from the marshal's office. She'd changed into a practical dress in dark blue, had pinned her hair severely back, and looked like someone preparing for war rather than tea. I'll take the east window, she said calmly. It covers the alley approach and the side street. Miss Alden, with all respect, you should be in the root cellar with Mrs.
Henshaw, one of the deputies said, a young man named Cooper with more chivalry than sense. With all respect, Deputy Cooper, I'm a better shot than you are, Grace replied evenly. I've seen your grouping at the practice range. Mine's tighter. So unless you want to trade positions and have me watch the main street while you cover the alley, I suggest you save the chivalry for after we've won. Cooper's face reddened, but he couldn't argue with the truth. Briggs chuckled low in his throat. Lady's got sand. All right, Miss Alden, you've got the east window, but you fire only on my command or if they breach the perimeter. Understood? Perfectly, Marshal. They took their positions as noon approached, the sun climbing high and hot, turning Prescott into a furnace of dust and tension. Caleb stationed himself at the main window with a rifle one of the deputies had loaned him, though his shoulder protested every time he tried to aim properly. Grace was to his right, watching the alley with the calm focus of someone who'd done this before. You holding up? Caleb asked quietly. I'm terrified, Grace admitted, but I'm functional. That'll have to be enough. The minutes stretched like hours, each second heavy with anticipation. Somewhere in town, a dog barked. A shutter banged in the wind. Normal sounds made sinister by context. Then Billy's rifle cracked from across the street, the warning shot. Here they come! His voice carried clear across the distance. 5 riders coming hard up Main Street. Caleb's heart kicked into a higher rhythm as he spotted the riders appearing through the heat shimmer at the far end of town. 5 men on horseback riding in loose formation, their intent clear in every line of their bodies. These weren't cowboys coming to town for supplies. These were men coming to kill. Hold your fire, Briggs commanded from his position at the center window. Let them get close enough for a challenge. Legal needs to be observed. The riders slowed as they approached the boarding house, spreading out slightly to present harder targets. Caleb recognized Seth Hadley in the lead. Same hard eyes as his brothers, same cruel set to his mouth. The other 4 were rough men, the kind who hired their guns out to whoever paid best and asked fewest questions. That's far enough, Briggs called out when they were 50 yards away. You're under the jurisdiction of territorial law. State your business or turn around. Seth Hadley's laugh was ugly. My business is with Caleb Rourke. He murdered my brothers. I'm here to collect what's owed. Jack Hadley died facing the consequences of robbery and murder, Briggs returned. And your brother Matt drew on Rourke in a fair fight. You've got no legal claim here, Seth. Ride away while you can. Legal? Seth spat. You talk to me about legal when you're harboring a killer? Send Rourke out and we ride away peaceful. Keep him and we come in shooting. Your choice, Marshal. Caleb stepped to the window where Seth could see him, ignoring Grace's sharp intake of breath. I'm right here, Hadley. You want me? Come get me. But leave the others out of this. Oh, I intend to get you, Rourke. Seth's hand moved toward his gun. Going to make you suffer the way my brothers suffered. Going to... He never finished the threat. Billy's rifle cracked from the rooftop, and one of Seth's men jerked backward in his saddle, clutching his shoulder. The street exploded into chaos. Seth and his remaining men charged forward, guns blazing, and the boarding house defenders returned fire. Caleb squeezed off 2 shots before his shoulder screamed protest, forcing him to lower the rifle. Grace's Spencer boomed beside him as 3 riders split off to flank through the alley. Grace, get down! Caleb shouted, but she was already dropping below the windowsill as bullets punched through the glass above her head. The world narrowed to gunfire and shouted commands, to the smell of powder smoke and the crash of breaking glass. Caleb drew his Colt with his good hand, knowing he'd be more accurate with the familiar weight of the pistol. Through the shattered window, he could see Seth dismounting, taking cover behind a water trough, still firing. Beside him, Grace rose just enough to aim her Spencer, fired, worked the lever to chamber another round, fired again. Caleb saw one of the flanking riders tumble from his horse, saw another wheel away, clutching a bleeding leg. They're trying to get to the back, Deputy Cooper yelled from the rear of the house, his rifle speaking in rapid sequence. Caleb forced himself upright, fighting through pain and dizziness, and moved toward the back room. He arrived just as one of Seth's men crashed through the kitchen window in a spray of glass and wood. The outlaw's gun was already coming up, already aiming at Cooper's back. Caleb fired twice, both shots catching the man in the chest, dropping him before he could squeeze his trigger. Cooper spun, eyes wide, realizing how close he'd come to dying.
Thanks, the deputy breathed. Watch your corners, Caleb said tersely, then had to grab the doorframe as pain lanced through his shoulder hard enough to gray his vision. Back in the main room, the gunfire was intensifying. Briggs was calling tactical commands, directing his deputies' fire with the precision of long experience. Grace had moved to a different window, was firing methodically, each shot deliberate and careful. Then Caleb heard it. The sound that made his blood run cold. A woman's scream cut short, Mrs. Henshaw. He raced toward the root cellar stairs, knowing he was leaving his defensive position, knowing it was tactically stupid, but unable to ignore the sound of someone in danger. He hit the cellar door just as it burst open from the inside, and a man emerged dragging Mrs. Henshaw by her hair, his gun pressed to her temple.
"Everybody stop shooting, or the old woman dies," the outlaw yelled, and Caleb recognized him as one of the original Hadley gang members who'd been in the canyon. The gunfire sputtered to a halt, an eerie silence falling over the boarding house. Caleb could hear Grace's sharp breathing from the main room, could feel the tension coiling like a spring about to break. "Let her go," Caleb said, his Colt steady despite the pain radiating from his shoulder. "She's not part of this." "Neither was Jack Hadley's wife, but she wept at his grave anyway," the outlaw snarled. "Everyone's part of something, Rourke. You should know that better than anyone, Mrs."
Henshaw's eyes were wide with terror, but there was steel there too. The same steel Caleb had seen in Grace. She was afraid but not broken, scared but still fighting. "What do you want?" Caleb asked, buying time, trying to find an angle. "I want you to drop that gun and walk out the front door. Seth's waiting for you. You face him like a man, and we let everyone else live. You refuse, and I start killing innocents, starting with this old woman." Caleb's mind raced through possibilities. He could try to shoot the outlaw, but the man had his gun pressed tight to Mrs. Henshaw's head. Even a perfect shot might result in a reflexive trigger pull that would kill her. He could refuse and hope the others could take the man down, but that gambled with an innocent woman's life. Or he could do what he'd done in the canyon, choose to face danger alone so others could live. "All right," Caleb said, lowering his Colt. "I'm putting down the gun. Let her go, and I'll walk out." "Caleb, no!" Grace's voice sharp with panic. "It's the only way," Caleb said, meeting her eyes across the room. "I won't let more innocent people die because of me." "How noble," the outlaw sneered. "Now kick that gun away and start walking." Caleb kicked the Colt toward the wall and started moving toward the front door, each step feeling like a death march. Through the broken windows, he could see Seth Hadley waiting in the street, his face twisted with anticipation of revenge. He'd almost reached the door when Grace's voice rang out, clear and commanding. "Mr. Fenwick, I believe you've forgotten something." The outlaw's eyes flicked toward Grace for just a fraction of a second, distracted by being addressed by name. That fraction was all Mrs. Henshaw needed. The landlady drove her elbow backward into her captor's stomach with surprising force, twisting away from the gun. Grace fired, her Spencer's bullet taking Fenwick in the shoulder and spinning him away from Mrs. Henshaw. Caleb dove for his fallen Colt, rolled, came up firing at the shapes moving outside the door. One of Seth's men dropped, another ducked back into cover. The house erupted into gunfire again, but this time Caleb was moving, ignoring the screaming pain in his shoulder, driven by something deeper than self-preservation. He reached the front door and kicked it open, stepping out into the street with his Colt blazing. Seth Hadley stood 20 feet away, his gun already drawn, already firing. Caleb felt a bullet tug at his vest, felt another pass so close to his head that it stirred his hair. But he didn't stop, didn't hesitate, walking forward through the gunfire with the kind of focused calm that came from having nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. His first shot took Seth in the gun arm, same as he'd done to Jack. His second hit center mass, staggering the outlaw backward. Seth fired again, wild and desperate, and Caleb felt the impact in his side, a burning line that meant a graze, painful but not fatal. His third shot ended it, dropping Seth Hadley into the dust of Prescott's main street beside the blood of his brothers. Caleb stood there, swaying, his Colt still raised, waiting for the next threat. But there were no more threats. The remaining outlaws were down or fled, and the street was quiet except for the ringing in his ears and the ragged sound of his own breathing. Then Grace was there, running from the boarding house with no regard for danger or propriety, throwing her arms around him hard enough to make his wounds scream protest. He didn't care. He wrapped his good arm around her and held on like she was the only solid thing in a world gone liquid with adrenaline and pain. "You're alive!" Grace sobbed against his chest. "You're alive! You're alive! You're alive!" "So are you," Caleb managed, his voice rough. "That's what matters. You and Mrs. Henshaw and everyone else. That's what matters." Dr. Brennan was less pleased when he examined Caleb an hour later and discovered the graze along his ribs and the torn stitches in his shoulder from the exertion of combat. He muttered darkly about stubborn patience and the futility of medical intervention while Grace held Caleb's hand and refused to let go. "You're lucky you didn't kill yourself," Brennan said, cleaning the graze with alcohol that burned like fire. "Another inch and that bullet would have perforated your liver." "But it didn't," Caleb said. "But it could have. And you tore half your stitches charging around like some penny dreadful hero. You'll need to start your recovery over from the beginning." "Worth it," Caleb said, looking at Grace. "All of it. Worth it." Marshal Briggs stopped by as evening fell, his expression a mixture of respect and exasperation. "Well, Rourke, you've managed to wipe out the entire Hadley gang in less than a week. That's got to be some kind of record." "Didn't do it alone," Caleb said. "No, you didn't." Briggs tipped his hat to Grace. "Miss Alden, that was some fine shooting. Fenwick's going to survive to stand trial, thanks to your accuracy. And that move with Mrs. Henshaw, quick thinking under pressure." Grace's smile was tired but genuine. "My mother always said a lady should be prepared for any situation." "Your mother raised you right." Briggs turned back to Caleb. "Seth's brothers are all dead now. Jack's body will be shipped to whatever family claims it. Matt's been in the ground 3 years, and Seth joined him today. The gang's scattered or captured. This territory's safer for what you did." "What we did," Caleb corrected, squeezing Grace's hand. After Briggs left, Caleb and Grace sat in the quiet of the boarding house room, watching the sun set through windows that were now boarded up pending proper repair. Mrs. Henshaw had insisted they stay despite the damage, saying she owed them her life and the least she could do was provide lodging. "It's over," Grace said softly. "Really over. No more threats. No more gangs hunting you." "For now," Caleb said. "There's always another threat in this territory. Always another man with a grudge or a gun." "Then we'll face them together," Grace said firmly. "That's what we do, apparently. Face impossible odds and somehow survive." Caleb pulled her closer, ignoring his protesting wounds. "I meant what I said. About loving you. About staying. If you'll have me, broken and scarred and carrying ghosts, I want to try. Want to build something instead of just running." Grace turned in his arms, her eyes searching his face. "You're sure? This isn't just adrenaline or relief at surviving?" "I'm sure. More sure than I've been about anything since Sarah died." Caleb cupped her face in his hand. "You showed me I could carry grief without letting it destroy me. Showed me that loving again doesn't betray what I lost. I want a future, Grace. With you. However that looks." "It looks like staying here while you heal properly this time," Grace said, but she was smiling through tears. "Looks like me helping my father with the bank, and you figuring out what a man does when he's not drifting. Looks like building something day by day until we wake up one morning and realize we've built a life." "Sounds terrifying," Caleb said. "Sounds perfect," Grace countered, and kissed him with a tenderness that promised tomorrow and the day after and all the days beyond that. Outside, Prescott settled into evening routines, the violence of the afternoon already becoming story and legend. But inside Mrs. Henshaw's damaged boarding house, two people who'd found each other in gunfire and grief held on tight, believing for the first time that surviving might actually lead to living. The weeks that followed the shootout passed in a rhythm Caleb had forgotten existed, the steady pulse of daily life unmarked by violence or the need to keep moving. Dr. Brennan's orders were strict this time, reinforced by Grace's unwavering supervision and Mrs. Henshaw's motherly tyranny. No riding, no heavy lifting, no pretending he was healed when he wasn't. Just rest and healing and the strange luxury of waking up in the same bed every morning, knowing he'd be there again that night. It terrified him almost as much as the gunfights had.
"You're brooding again," Grace said from her chair by the window where she was reviewing ledgers for her father's bank. 3 weeks had passed since the Hadley gang's final attack, and she'd settled into a routine of splitting her days between the bank and Caleb's recovery, as natural as breathing. "I'm thinking," Caleb corrected, though he knew she was right. He'd been staring at the same page of the newspaper for 10 minutes without reading a word. Thinking looked suspiciously like worrying. Grace set down her pen and crossed to sit on the edge of his bed. "What's troubling you?" Caleb wanted to deflect, to rebuild the walls that had served him so well for 8 years. But Grace had a way of looking at him that made dishonesty impossible, so he told her the truth. "I don't know how to do this, live somewhere, be part of something. I've been drifting so long I don't remember what it means to stay." "No one expects you to have it all figured out immediately," Grace said gently. "Staying doesn't mean you need to know your entire future tomorrow. It just means choosing not to run today. And tomorrow? You make the same choice, and the day after. Until one day you realize you've stopped thinking about leaving and started thinking about what color to paint the fence." Grace's smile was soft, but carried an edge of her own uncertainty. "I'm figuring it out too, you know. I came here planning to spend 6 months helping Father establish the bank, then return to Philadelphia. Now I'm negotiating with contractors about office furniture and wondering if I should order winter clothes because I might still be here when snow comes." "Because of me?" "Because of us," Grace corrected. "Because what we're building, whatever it becomes, feels more real than anything I left behind in Philadelphia. More honest. Like I'm finally living instead of just performing the role of Grace Alden, dutiful daughter and tragic widow." Caleb reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. The simple gesture still felt new and precious, something he had to consciously choose instead of an automatic reflex. 8 years alone had made touch foreign, and he was slowly relearning the language of it through Grace's patient presence. "Your father arrives next week," he said, voicing the worry that had been circling his mind like a vulture. "What happens when he sees what you've chosen? A broken-down gunfighter with no prospects and a history of violence?" Grace's expression turned stern, the look she used when someone underestimated her. "My father is a practical man who values courage, integrity, and the ability to protect what matters. You've demonstrated all three, and if he has concerns, he'll voice them directly to both of us like the civilized adult he is, and we'll address them like the civilized adults we are." "You make it sound simple." "It is simple. Not easy, but simple." Grace squeezed his hand. "Father wants me to be happy. You make me happy. Therefore, Father will make peace with you or answer to me. And trust me when I say he finds the latter prospect more terrifying than any gunfight." Despite his anxiety, Caleb smiled. He'd seen Grace face down outlaws with that same implacable determination, and he didn't doubt she'd bring the same energy to managing her father's expectations. A knock at the door interrupted the moment, and Reverend Thomas entered carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread and something sweet. The preacher had become a regular visitor during Caleb's recovery, stopping by most afternoons to talk philosophy, argue theology, and play chess with a skill that surprised Caleb. "Good afternoon, Miss Alden, Mr. Rourke," Thomas said, setting the basket on the small table. "Mrs. Patterson from the church sent apple butter and fresh rolls. Said a man recovering from wounds needs proper feeding." "Mrs. Patterson's been sending food for 2 weeks," Caleb said. "At this rate, I'll be too heavy to sit a horse." "Perhaps that's the idea," Thomas replied with a twinkle in his eye. "Hard to drift when you're well fed and settled. The ladies of Prescott are nothing if not strategic in their kindness." Grace laughed, moving to inspect the basket's contents. "I'll leave you gentlemen to your chess match. I promised Father I'd review the security arrangements for the bank vault before tomorrow's meeting." She kissed Caleb's cheek with an ease that still made his heart skip, then gathered her ledgers and headed for the door. "Try not to let him beat you too badly, Reverend. His pride is still recovering along with his shoulder." After she left, Thomas set up the chessboard on the small table between the bed and the chair, his movements unhurried and deliberate. The preacher was in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of peaceful presence that came from genuine faith rather than performed piety. He'd ridden in the stagecoach during the Hadley attack, had prayed over the wounded, and had never once questioned why God had allowed such violence. Instead, he'd simply helped clean up the aftermath and moved forward with quiet grace. "You're troubled,"
Thomas observed as he arranged the pieces. More than usual, I mean. Care to talk about it? Caleb moved a pawn forward, buying time to organize his thoughts. Grace's father arrives next week. Charles Alden, successful banker, Philadelphia society, the kind of man who knows which fork to use at formal dinners. And he gestured at himself, at the shabby room, at everything he represented. A man who saved his daughter's life multiple times and makes her happier than she's been in years? Thomas moved his own pawn. Seems like that should count for something. I've got no money, no prospects, no future beyond whatever jobs I can pick up. I'm a drifter who happened to stop drifting. What father wants that for his daughter? Thomas was quiet for a moment, studying the board, though Caleb suspected he was really studying the man across from it. Tell me something, Caleb. What did you do before? Before Sarah died? Before you started drifting? What was your life? Caleb moved his knight, the question pulling at memories he'd tried to bury. I worked a small ranch outside Denver. Nothing fancy, couple hundred head of cattle, enough land to make a living if you worked hard. Sarah taught at the local school. We had plans to expand, hire help, maybe start breeding horses. It was good, honest work. So you know how to build something, how to work land, manage livestock, create value from labor and patience. Thomas's move was aggressive, pressuring Caleb's position. Those skills don't disappear just because you stopped using them. That was a different man, a different life. Was it? Or was it the same man choosing different responses to his circumstances? Thomas leaned back in his chair. You spent 8 years running because grief convinced you that's all you deserved. But running is a choice, Caleb. So is staying. So is building. The man who ran isn't fundamentally different from the man who built that ranch. He was just making different choices based on different beliefs about what he deserved. The words hit harder than Caleb expected, resonating with the conversations he'd been having with Grace about guilt and grief and the possibility of redemption. He captured one of Thomas's pieces, buying time to think. Even if I wanted to start over, build something like that ranch, I don't have the capital. Don't have anything except the reward money Morrison insisted on splitting with me, and that's maybe enough to live on for a few months, not enough to buy land. True, Thomas acknowledged. But you have something more valuable than capital. You have skills, determination, and a woman who believes in you enough to bet her future on your character. That's a foundation most men never find. The rest is just details and hard work. They played in silence for a while, the chess pieces moving in their eternal dance of strategy and sacrifice. Caleb found himself thinking about the ranch he'd lost, about the satisfaction of building something with his own hands, of watching cattle thrive on land he'd improved, of the simple pride of honest labor. He thought that part of his life was buried with Sarah, that wanting those things again would somehow betray her memory. But Grace's words from weeks ago echoed in his mind. Would he erase the love to escape the pain? And if the answer was no, then maybe the same logic applied to the life he'd built. Maybe wanting to build again didn't diminish what he'd lost. Maybe it honored it by refusing to let grief destroy everything he'd once valued. Checkmate, Thomas said gently, and Caleb realized he'd been so lost in thought he'd walked into a trap 3 moves deep. My mind wasn't on the game, Caleb admitted. I noticed. Where was it? Caleb looked at the preacher, this man who'd faced death calmly in that stagecoach, and who now offered friendship without judgment or agenda. On possibilities, on what it might mean to stay not just for Grace, but for myself. To build something because I want to, not just because I'm afraid of being alone. Thomas smiled. That sounds like progress, the kind that matters more than any chess game. He began resetting the pieces for another match. You know, the church owns some land about 5 miles outside town, 20 acres that was donated by a member who passed last year. It's been sitting unused, good grazing land, access to water, timber for building. The church council's been discussing what to do with it. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that a man with ranching experience who's proven his character through action might be exactly the kind of person we'd want developing that land. We could lease it to you, reasonable terms, with an option to purchase once you've proven the operation viable. Thomas met Caleb's eyes directly. Not charity, business. The church gets the land developed and generating value. You get a chance to build something. Everyone benefits. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, hope mixed with fear, possibility tangled with doubt. I'd need to see the land, need to assess what it could support. Of course, I can arrange a ride out there once Dr. Brennan clears you for horses. No commitment, just looking. Though I suspect once you see it, you'll start calculating head count and fence lines, whether you intend to or not. Thomas's smile was knowing. Men like you need to build, Caleb. It's part of who you are. Grief made you forget that, but it's still true. Before Caleb could respond, Grace returned with a troubled expression that immediately put him on alert. She'd only been gone an hour, not nearly long enough for the meeting she'd mentioned. "What's wrong?" Caleb asked as she crossed to him. "Nothing's wrong exactly, just unexpected." Grace sat on the bed beside him, her hands twisting together in a gesture of nervousness he'd learned to recognize. "Father's train arrived early. He's here, in Prescott, now." Caleb felt his stomach drop. "How early?" 3 days early. Something about rearranging his schedule to accommodate a business opportunity in Denver. Grace's eyes were wide with mingled anxiety and determination. "He's at the hotel, settling in. He wants to meet you. Tonight. Dinner at the Prescott house at 7. "Tonight," Caleb repeated, looking down at himself. He was wearing borrowed clothes, still recovering from gunshot wounds, living in a boarding house room that had been shot to pieces. Not exactly the circumstances he'd hoped for when meeting the father of the woman he loved. Thomas stood, gathering the chess set with diplomatic efficiency. "I'll leave you two to prepare. Caleb, think about what I said. About the land. About building. About choosing what you deserve instead of what grief tells you you're allowed." He tipped his hat to Grace. "Miss Alden, your father is fortunate to have raised such a remarkable woman. I'm sure tonight will go better than you fear." After the preacher left, Caleb and Grace sat in silence for a moment, both processing the sudden acceleration of their timeline. "Are you angry I didn't warn you he might come early?" Grace asked quietly. "No, you didn't know." Caleb took her hand, trying to calm the anxiety he could feel radiating from her. "Tell me about him. Really tell me. What should I know?" Grace was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "Father is brilliant with numbers and terrible with emotions. He loved my mother desperately, but could barely tell her so. When she died 5 years ago, he buried himself in work because he didn't know how else to grieve. He's fair but exacting, generous but practical, and he measures people by their actions more than their words. So I should be honest. Brutally so. He'll respect that more than any attempt to present yourself as something you're not." Grace's grip tightened on his hand. "But Caleb, you should know, he wrote to me after receiving my letter about the attack. He was furious that I'd been in danger, furious with the stage line, with the territorial authorities, with himself for letting me travel alone. He will probably want to blame someone. And I'm convenient. You're the man his daughter fell in love with after knowing you for less than a week. A man with a violent past and an uncertain future. He'll want to protect me, which means he'll look for reasons you're not good enough." Grace's eyes were fierce. "But I won't let him dismiss you, won't let him reduce everything you are to convenient categories. You're more than your past, Caleb, and I'll make sure he sees that." Caleb pulled her close, breathing in the lavender scent of her hair, trying to find calm in the storm of anxiety churning through him. "What if he's right? What if I'm not good enough for you?" "Then I'll be not good enough for you right back, and we'll be imperfect together." Grace pulled away enough to meet his eyes. "I don't need perfect, Caleb. I need real. I need you. And Father will accept that, or he'll learn to live with disappointment." At 7 o'clock sharp, Caleb walked into the Prescott House dining room with Grace on his arm, wearing the only decent clothes he owned, dark trousers and a white shirt that Morrison had loaned him, his boots polished to a shine by Mrs. Henshaw. His shoulder ached from the effort of dressing properly, but he'd be damned if he'd meet Charles Alden looking like an invalid. The man waiting at a corner table was in his late 50s, distinguished in the way that came from money and power worn comfortably. Silver threaded through his dark hair, and his suit probably cost more than Caleb had earned in the past year. But his eyes were sharp and assessing as they took in Caleb's approach, measuring and cataloging with the precision of a banker evaluating collateral. "Father," Grace said warmly, kissing his cheek. "You're looking well. How was the journey?"
Tedious and dusty, as all train journeys are. Charles Alden stood, extending his hand to Caleb with formal courtesy. "Mr. Rourke, my daughter's letters have been quite informative, though I suspect the reality is more complicated than even her detailed accounts suggested." Caleb shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and calluses that suggested Charles Alden hadn't always worked at a desk. "Mr. Alden, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. I wanted to meet the man who saved Grace's life, multiple times, according to her account." Charles gestured for them to sit, his movements precise and controlled. "Though I confess I'm still processing the fact that my daughter shot a man. That's not typically covered in finishing school curriculum." "She saved my life," Caleb said simply. "Without her shot, Hadley would have killed me." "So I understand, which brings me to an uncomfortable question." Charles's eyes were hard now, the banker's mask falling away to reveal the protective father beneath. "Why was my daughter in a position to need to save anyone's life? Why was she shooting at outlaws instead of safely away from danger?" "Because I'm stubborn and refuse to run," Grace interjected before Caleb could answer. "Because when Caleb told me to flee, I chose to stay and fight. That was my choice, Father, not his. A choice you wouldn't have needed to make if you'd been properly protected in the first place," Charles countered. "The stage line assured me you'd have armed escort through dangerous territory. I paid premium rates for that assurance." "And they provided it," Caleb said quietly. "I was hired as point rider specifically to scout for threats and provide armed defense, which I did." "You got shot doing it," Charles said bluntly. "Twice, from what Grace tells me. Once in the canyon, once defending Mrs. Henshaw's boarding house. That suggests either poor planning or reckless disregard for your own safety." The accusation stung because it carried truth, but Caleb met Charles's eyes steadily. "You're right on the second count. I did show reckless disregard for my own safety, but not because I don't value my life, because I valued Grace's life more, and Mrs. Henshaw's, and every person in that coach and boarding house. When you have to choose between your safety and someone else's, you make a choice that defines who you are. I chose to put myself between danger and innocent people. I'd make the same choice again." Charles studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he turned to Grace. "You love this man." It wasn't a question, but Grace answered anyway. "Yes, I love him." "Why?" Grace didn't hesitate. "Because he's honest about his wounds instead of hiding them. Because he gave up everything to protect strangers. Because when I look at him, I see someone who understands loss without being destroyed by it. Because he makes me want to be braver, stronger, more present in my own life. And because when I'm with him, I'm not the tragic widow or the dutiful daughter. I'm just Grace, and that's enough." The words made Caleb's throat tight, and he had to look away for a moment to collect himself. Charles was quiet, his fingers drumming against the white tablecloth in a rhythm that suggested deep thought. Finally, he spoke directly to Caleb. "Tell me about your wife, about what happened in Colorado." The request was unexpected, and Caleb felt all his instincts screaming to deflect, to protect the wound. But Grace's hand found his under the table, steady and warm, and he forced himself to answer honestly. "Her name was Sarah. We were married 3 years when she died. She was 6 months pregnant with our first child, a boy," the midwife said later. "I was on a cattle drive when a Cheyenne raiding party hit our settlement. They burned the cabin with Sarah inside. She and the baby both died." Caleb's voice was rough but steady. "I spent 8 years afterward drifting, taking jobs that might get me killed, convinced I didn't deserve to survive when they hadn't. Grace showed me that grief doesn't have to mean the end of everything, that carrying loss doesn't require destroying the possibility of finding something new. And now? What are your intentions toward my daughter?" "To marry her if she'll have me," Caleb said bluntly, "to build a life worthy of the faith she's shown in me, to protect her, provide for her, and spend every day trying to deserve the love she's offering." "With what resources?" Charles asked. "You're a drifter with no steady employment, recovering from gunshot wounds in a boarding house. What kind of future can you offer her?" "An honest one," Caleb said. "I can't promise her wealth or society functions or the comforts she grew up with.
But I can promise her loyalty, hard work, and the determination to build something that lasts. Reverend Thomas has offered to lease me church land for ranching. It's not much, but it's a start. And I know cattle, know how to build a viable operation from nothing. It'll be hard work and lean years at first, but I've done it before. Charles's expression shifted slightly, interest replacing some of the skepticism. You ran a ranch in Colorado? Small operation, 200 head at peak, good grazing land, steady growth year over year. It was profitable and sustainable before everything ended. And you think you can replicate that success here? In territory that's still largely wild, with limited infrastructure and markets? I know I can, Caleb said with quiet confidence. The fundamentals don't change. Good land, good stock, good management. The territory's growing, which means growing demand for beef. The railroad's expanding, which means access to markets. In 5 years, Wyoming will be ready to boom. The ranchers who establish themselves now will be the ones who profit. For the first time, Charles Alden smiled. A small thing, barely there, but genuine. You've thought about this, actually considered the economics and logistics. I've had time to think while recovering, time to imagine what building a future might look like instead of just surviving day to day. Caleb glanced at Grace. Your daughter gave me that. Gave me the belief that I might deserve a future after all. The waiter appeared to take their orders, and the conversation shifted to safer topics during dinner: the growth of Prescott, the banking opportunities in the territory, Philadelphia society news that made Grace roll her eyes fondly. But Caleb could feel Charles assessing him throughout the meal, weighing and measuring in that banker's way. It wasn't until dessert arrived that Charles returned to the central question. Mr. Rourke, I won't pretend I'm entirely comfortable with this situation. My daughter deserves security, comfort, a life free from violence and uncertainty. You represent the opposite of all those things. Caleb felt his heart sink, but Charles wasn't finished. However, the banker continued, I've spent my career evaluating risk and potential, and what I see in you is a man who's honest about his limitations, clear-eyed about his challenges, and determined to overcome them through hard work rather than false promises. I see someone who protected my daughter at great personal cost, who inspires her to bravery rather than timidity, and who makes her happier than I've seen her since Thomas died. Charles paused, his eyes moving between them. I also see two people who've found something rare and worth fighting for, and I'd be a fool to stand in the way of that simply because it doesn't fit my preferred timeline or circumstances. Grace's hand tightened on Caleb's, her breath catching with hope. So here's what I propose, Charles said. I'll provide backing for your ranching operation. Not a gift, a business loan at fair interest rates with clear terms and expectations. You'll submit quarterly reports on the operation's progress, maintain transparent accounting, and demonstrate that you're building something sustainable. If after 2 years you've proven the operation viable, I'll forgive half the loan as a wedding gift. If you fail, I won't fail, Caleb interrupted, then caught himself. I apologize for interrupting, sir, but I need you to understand, I won't fail. Not because of pride, but because I finally have something worth succeeding for. I'll work every day to prove I deserve your faith and your daughter's love. Charles studied him for another long moment, then extended his hand across the table. Then, I believe we have an agreement, Mr. Rourke. Welcome to the family, provisionally. Caleb shook the offered hand, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath him in fundamental ways. An hour ago, he'd been a drifter with nothing but hope and determination. Now he had backing, opportunity, and the tentative blessing of the man whose opinion mattered most to Grace. Grace was crying openly now, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. Father, thank you. You won't regret this. I'd better not, Charles said, but his voice was warm. I'm trusting you both to prove me right about this investment, both the financial one and the emotional one. After dinner, Grace and Caleb walked back to the boarding house through streets lit by oil lamps and the silver light of a rising moon. They moved slowly, savoring the cool evening air and the privacy of darkness. I can't believe that just happened, Grace said, leaning into Caleb's side. Father never acts impulsively. Never. And he just committed to backing a ranching operation run by a man he met 3 hours ago. He did it for you, Caleb said. Because he sees how happy you are. Because he trusts your judgment even when it scares him. He did it because he recognized in you what I see every day, Grace corrected. Integrity, determination, the willingness to work for what matters. Father values those qualities above almost everything else. They reached Mrs. Henshaw's boarding house and stood on the porch, neither quite ready to end the evening. Above them, stars wheeled across the vast Wyoming sky, indifferent to human drama, but beautiful in their distance. "Caleb," Grace said softly, turning to face him, "when you told Father you intended to marry me, did you mean that? Or were you just saying what he needed to hear?" Caleb cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears that still clung to her cheeks. "I meant every word. I love you, Grace Alden. Want to spend my life proving I deserve the gift of your faith. Want to build something together that honors both what we've lost and what we've found. So yes, I intend to marry you, if you'll have a broken-down former drifter with more scars than prospects." "I'll have you," Grace whispered. "Scars and all, today and tomorrow and every day after." She kissed him then, deep and sure and full of promise, and Caleb felt the last pieces of his carefully constructed walls crumble away. For 8 years he'd been running from the possibility of this, of love and hope, and the terrifying vulnerability that came with letting someone matter. Now, standing on a boarding house porch in Prescott, Wyoming, with Grace in his arms and stars overhead, he finally understood what he'd been running toward all along. Not escape from grief, but the chance to live fully enough to honor both what he'd lost and what he'd found. "Come see the land with me tomorrow," he said when they finally broke apart. "Reverend Thomas offered to take us out to the church property. I want you to see it. Tell me if you can imagine building a life there." "I can imagine building a life anywhere with you," Grace said. "But yes, let's see the land. Let's start turning possibilities into plans." That night, lying in bed with moonlight streaming through the repaired windows, Caleb thought about the question Charles Alden had asked. What kind of future could he offer Grace? And he realized the answer wasn't about wealth or security or comfort. It was about showing up every day and choosing to build instead of run. About honoring loss without being destroyed by it. About loving with the full knowledge that loss was possible, but choosing to love anyway, because the alternative was a kind of death. He thought about Sarah and the life they'd built, and for the first time in 8 years, the memory didn't bring crushing guilt, just gentle sadness mixed with gratitude for the love they'd shared. Sarah would have liked Grace, he thought, would have approved of him finding someone who challenged him to be better, to live fully, to stop punishing himself for surviving. And their unborn son, Caleb let himself think about the child for the first time in years, let himself imagine the boy he'd never gotten to meet. Would have wanted his father to be happy, he thought. Would have wanted him to live instead of just existing. The realization felt like forgiveness, like permission he'd been waiting 8 years to receive. And as sleep finally claimed him, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced since Colorado. Peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of hope strong enough to carry the weight of loss without being crushed by it. Tomorrow, they'd see the land. Tomorrow, they'd start turning dreams into plans. Tomorrow, they'd take the first real steps toward building the future he'd thought was buried with his past. But tonight, he simply rested in the knowledge that he was loved and whole enough to love in return. And that was more than enough to build on. Morning came with the kind of crystalline clarity that only Wyoming could produce. The sky so blue it hurt to look at, and air so clean it felt like drinking light. Caleb woke before dawn from habit, then lay still for a moment, savoring the unfamiliar sensation of anticipation rather than dread. Today, they'd see the land. Today, possibilities would start becoming reality. Grace arrived at the boarding house just after breakfast, dressed in practical riding clothes that Mrs. Henshaw had helped her acquire from the general store. The transformation from Philadelphia banker's daughter to Wyoming woman was nearly complete. Her hands had developed calluses from helping at the bank. Her skin had taken on a healthy glow from prairie sun, and her eyes held a confidence that came from facing danger and discovering she could survive it. "Ready?" she asked, though her own nervous energy suggested the question was as much for herself as for him. "As I'll ever be," Caleb said, accepting the arm she offered to help him down the stairs. Dr. Brennan had finally cleared him for light activity, though with stern warnings about overdoing it. His shoulder still ached, especially in the mornings, but the wound was healing cleanly and his strength was returning day by day. Reverend Thomas waited outside with a buckboard and two sturdy horses, his expression peaceful as always, but with an edge of excitement in his eyes. Beautiful morning for looking at land. The property's about 5 miles north. We should arrive by mid-morning. Charles Alden emerged from the hotel just as they were preparing to leave, dressed in expensive but practical clothes that suggested a man who understood the difference between Eastern boardrooms and Western practicality. "I'll accompany you if there's no objection. I'd like to see what I'm investing in." The ride north took them through country that opened Caleb's chest with its raw beauty. Rolling grassland dotted with sage and wildflowers, stands of cottonwood marking where water ran, mountains rising in the distance like promises of permanence. The land spoke to something deep in him, the part that had always found peace in open spaces, and the honest work of building something from earth and effort. "The property borders Clear Creek to the west," Thomas explained as they traveled. "Year-round water source, which is crucial in this climate. The eastern boundary runs along that ridgeline, natural fence line, cuts down on the amount of actual fencing you'd need. Southern exposure for the grazing land means it greens up early in spring and holds longer into fall." Caleb absorbed every detail, his mind already calculating carrying capacity, water distribution, where to site buildings for maximum efficiency and protection from weather. It was like waking muscles that had been dormant for years, rediscovering skills he'd thought were buried with his old life. They crested a low rise, and Thomas pulled the buckboard to a halt. "There it is, 20 acres of possibility." The land spread before them like an answer to questions Caleb hadn't known how to ask. The creek Thomas had mentioned ran clear and cold through the western edge, bordered by cottonwoods that would provide summer shade for livestock. The grazing land rolled gently, a mix of native grasses that cattle would thrive on. A natural shelf of land near the creek offered the perfect spot for a house, high enough to avoid spring flooding, low enough to be sheltered from winter wind, with a view that stretched to the mountains. Grace's hand found Caleb's, squeezing hard enough to hurt. "It's perfect," she breathed. "It's raw land," Charles said practically, but there was approval in his voice. "It'll take significant work to develop. House, barn, fencing, breaking horses, acquiring stock. We're looking at a minimum of 2 years before it generates any return on investment." 3 years to be conservative," Caleb corrected, his eyes still on the land. "First year is all infrastructure, buildings, fences, acquiring foundation stock. Second year is establishing the herd, proving they can thrive here. Third year is first significant sale of cattle, demonstrating the operation's viability." He glanced at Charles. "But done right. By year 5, this could support 50 head comfortably, with room to expand. And if the railroad continues pushing west the way everyone expects, market access will only improve." Charles nodded slowly, the gesture of a man recognizing competent assessment. "You've thought this through." "I've had nothing but time to think for 3 weeks," Caleb said. "And I learned a long time ago that hope without planning is just daydreaming. This can work, Mr. Alden, but only if we're realistic about the challenges and honest about the timeline." They climbed down from the buckboard and walked the property, Thomas pointing out boundary markers, while Caleb assessed the land with the practiced eye of someone who understood what it could become. Grace stayed close to his side, occasionally asking questions that revealed she'd been paying attention to everything he'd told her about ranching during their long conversations. "Where would you put the house?" she asked as they stood on the natural shelf overlooking the creek. Caleb turned slowly, visualizing. "Here, kitchen window facing east to catch morning light, porch facing west for evening sun. Bedroom on the south side where it'll stay warmer in winter. Root cellar dug into the hillside there for natural cooling." He paused, then added quietly, "Big enough for a family, with room to grow." Grace's eyes shimmered with tears, but she was smiling. "I can see it. See us here. See children running down to the creek in summer, horses in that meadow, cattle grazing those hills. See a life built from hard work and hope." "It won't be easy," Caleb warned, needing her to understand fully what she was choosing. "First few years will be brutal. Long days, physical labor, never enough money or time. You'll wear dresses until they fall apart, cook meals from whatever we can grow or hunt, go months without seeing anyone beyond the people in town. It's nothing like the life you left in Philadelphia." "Good," Grace said fiercely. "I don't want the life I left. I want this one. The real one, the one we build together. Charles had been walking the perimeter with Thomas, examining the land with a banker's assessment of value and potential. When he returned, his expression was thoughtful but not discouraging. "The land is solid," he said. "Water rights are established. Soil quality appears good. Natural shelter from weather." "Thomas, what's the church's asking price for lease with option to purchase?" The Reverend named a figure that made Caleb wince. It was fair, even generous, but it still represented more money than he'd ever had at once. Charles didn't even blink. "I'll cover the first year's lease as part of the initial capital investment," he said. "That gives you 12 months to establish infrastructure and acquire stock without that particular financial pressure. After that, the lease payments come from operational funds. If at the end of 3 years you've proven the operation viable, I'll provide the capital to exercise the purchase option. The land becomes yours, owned outright." Caleb felt his throat tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. "Mr. Alden, that's extraordinarily generous. I don't know how to thank you." "Thank me by succeeding," Charles said bluntly. "Thank me by making my daughter happy and building something that lasts. Thank me by proving that my assessment of your character and capability was accurate. That's all the thanks I need." Thomas cleared his throat, his eyes twinkling with suppressed amusement. "I believe this is the point where we discuss specifics and draw up preliminary agreements, though perhaps we should do that somewhere more comfortable than standing in a field. Mrs. Patterson has invited us all to lunch at the church. We could work through details there." The lunch was a revelation of community that Caleb had forgotten existed. Mrs. Patterson had rallied half the church congregation, and suddenly the afternoon turned into an impromptu planning session with ranchers offering advice on stock acquisition, carpenters discussing building materials, and women pressing recipes on Grace with the knowing looks of those who'd survived frontier hardships. Old John Morrison, who ran a spread 20 miles north, clasped Caleb's good shoulder with a grip like iron. "Heard about what you did with the Hadley gang. That took sand. You've got the respect of every honest man in this territory." "Just did what needed doing," Caleb said, uncomfortable with the praise. "No, you did more than that. You stood between danger and innocent folks without hesitation. That's character." Morrison's eyes were shrewd beneath bushy white eyebrows. "I've got some foundation stock you might be interested in. Good breeding cows, solid bloodlines. I'll sell you 6 head at cost, give you terms you can afford. Consider it investment in a neighbor I'd be proud to have." "John, I can't accept—" "You can and you will," Morrison interrupted. "This territory survives because neighbors help neighbors. Someday I'll need help and you'll provide it. That's how it works out here. Pride's fine, but practical assistance is better." Throughout the afternoon, similar offers materialized: lumber at reduced rates, help with the barn raising, loans of equipment until Caleb could acquire his own. The community that had seemed so foreign during his years of drifting was revealing itself as something real and sustaining, the kind of web of mutual support that built civilizations in harsh places. Grace watched it all with wonder in her eyes, and when she caught Caleb's gaze across the crowded church hall, her smile told him she understood what he was feeling: the terror and joy of belonging, of being seen and accepted, of having people invest in your success because they believed in your worth. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Charles pulled Caleb aside for a private conversation on the church steps. The banker's expression was serious but not unkind, the look of a man about to say difficult truths. "Mr. Rourke, I need to be direct with you about something," Charles began. "I'm providing this financial backing not because I think you need charity, but because I recognize you need capital to restart a life that was violently interrupted. However, I want to be clear about my expectations regarding my daughter." Caleb braced himself for whatever judgment was coming. "Grace has already lost one man she loved. The pain of that loss nearly destroyed her. I watched her withdraw from life for months, watched her become a shadow of herself. She's only recently begun to heal, to reclaim her vitality and hope." Charles's eyes were hard now, protective father overwhelming the reasonable banker. "If you do this, if you marry her, build this life with her, you cannot allow yourself to die. Not through recklessness, not through carrying guilt that makes you careless with your own safety, not through any of the self-destructive patterns that marked your last 8 years. Do you understand what I'm saying?" You're saying Grace can't survive losing someone else she loves, Caleb said quietly. I'm saying neither of you can, Charles corrected. I'm saying that loving someone who's survived profound loss carries the responsibility of honoring that survival, of choosing life deliberately, every day, even when grief or pain or fear make death seem easier. Grace has made that choice for herself. I need to know you can make it too. The words landed with the weight of truth, and Caleb found himself thinking about all the times over the past 8 years when he'd been careless with his own safety, when some part of him had hoped the next bullet would end the struggle of continuing to exist. He thought about walking out to face Hadley, about charging into danger without real regard for whether he survived it. But he also thought about Grace falling asleep against his shoulder, about her steady hands keeping him alive, about the way she'd refused to let him die alone. Thought about the future they were building, and the responsibility that came with being loved by someone who'd already buried too much. I understand, Caleb said finally. And I promise you, I promise Grace, and I promise myself that I'll fight to live every day. Not just survive, but really live. Choose hope over despair, building over running, life over the slow death I've been practicing. That's the man I want to be for her, the man I need to be for myself. Charles studied him for a long moment, then extended his hand. Then you have my blessing, full and unreserved. Welcome to the family, son. The word son nearly undid Caleb's composure, but he shook Charles's hand firmly, accepting the gift of being claimed by someone who had no obligation to care about him beyond his connection to Grace. They were married 3 weeks later in a ceremony that was both smaller and larger than anything Caleb had imagined. Small in that it was just the Prescott Church congregation, with Reverend Thomas officiating and Grace wearing a simple dress of cream-colored silk that made her look like she was glowing from within. Large in that the entire community turned out, filling the small church to capacity and spilling out into the yard, because apparently the story of the cowboy who'd faced down the Hadley gang and the banker's daughter who'd shot an outlaw to save him had become the kind of legend that people wanted to witness the next chapter of. Caleb stood at the altar in new clothes that Charles had insisted on providing. A man should be married in his own suit, not borrowed clothes, and watched Grace walk down the aisle on her father's arm. She was smiling through tears, and when she reached him and took his hands, he felt 8 years of ice finally, fully melt away. I love you, he whispered as Thomas began the ceremony. Thank you for not giving up on me. I love you, Grace whispered back. Thank you for letting me stay. The vows were traditional but felt revolutionary when spoken by two people who'd both buried their first loves and found the courage to try again. When Thomas pronounced them married and Caleb kissed his wife, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers that rattled the church windows. The reception was a community affair held on the church grounds, with food contributed by every family in attendance and music provided by a fiddle player who seemed to know every song ever written. Caleb danced with Grace, his shoulder protesting slightly, but his heart too full to care, and felt the weight of solitude he'd carried for 8 years finally lift completely. Charles Alden pulled them aside during a break in the dancing, his expression warm in a way Caleb had never seen before. I have a wedding gift for you both, he said, handing Caleb an envelope. Don't open it until you're alone. That night, in the small house on their land that the community had spent 3 weeks building in an intensive barn-raising effort, Caleb and Grace finally opened Charles's envelope. Inside was a deed, not a lease agreement, but a full deed transferring ownership of the 20 acres to their names, and a letter in Charles's precise handwriting. My dear Grace and Caleb, Grace read aloud, her voice thick with emotion. I had intended to make you work for this land, to prove yourselves worthy of ownership through years of labor and dedication. But watching you pledge your lives to each other today, I realized I'd already seen all the proof I needed. You've both survived losses that would have destroyed lesser people. You've both chosen hope when despair would have been easier. You've both demonstrated the courage to build again after having everything destroyed. That's worth more than any business plan or financial projection. Build your life here with my blessing and my love. The land is yours. Make it a home worthy of the family you'll raise on it. With deepest affection, Charles. Grace was crying openly now, and Caleb wasn't far behind, both of them overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gift. They held each other in the small bedroom of their new house, moonlight streaming through windows that overlooked land that was finally, truly theirs. We have a home, Grace whispered against his chest. A real home. Not something temporary or borrowed, but ours. We have more than that, Caleb said, tilting her face up to meet his eyes. We have a future. And we have each other. Everything else is just details. The first year was exactly as hard as Caleb had warned it would be. They worked from dawn to dusk, building fences, establishing the herd with stock purchased from Morrison and other neighboring ranchers, learning the rhythm of the land and the demands of each season. Grace proved to be as capable with cattle as she'd been with carbines, fearless in the face of difficult work and uncomplaining about the primitive conditions. There were moments when doubt crept in, when Caleb would wake in the night and wonder if he was fooling himself, if he could really build something lasting after 8 years of running. But then Grace would stir beside him, her hand finding his in the darkness, and he'd remember that he wasn't building alone, that the strength required to create a life wasn't something he had to summon solo, but something they could build together. Charles visited regularly throughout that first year, ostensibly to check on his investment, but really to ensure his daughter was thriving. And thrive she did. Grace bloomed under the demands of frontier life, her initial refinement giving way to capable strength without losing the intelligence and compassion that defined her. The second year brought their first significant profit from cattle sales, and a piece of news that filled their small house with joy and terror in equal measure. Grace was pregnant, due to deliver in late spring. "How do you feel about it?" Grace asked one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over land that was finally starting to feel less like a dream and more like reality. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, working through emotions that were complicated and profound. "Terrified," he admitted. "After what happened to Sarah and the baby, I'm terrified of losing you both, of history repeating itself." "But?" Grace prompted, hearing the unspoken continuation. "But also hopeful, excited, grateful that we get this chance, that life is generous enough to offer second beginnings even after terrible endings." Caleb's hand settled on the gentle swell of her belly, feeling the flutter of movement beneath. "I'm going to be a father. We're going to be parents. That's everything." Grace covered his hand with hers. "We're going to be fine, all three of us. I believe that with everything I am." The pregnancy progressed without complication, and when Grace went into labor on a warm May evening with apple blossoms drifting past their windows, Dr. Brennan and Mrs. Patterson were there to assist. Caleb paced the small house like a caged animal, remembering the last time he'd waited for a child to be born and how that story had ended. But this story was different. When the baby's cry finally pierced the evening air, strong and furious and utterly alive, Caleb felt something in his chest crack open in a way that was painful and joyous and transformative. Doctor. Brennan emerged with a squalling bundle, his face creased in a huge smile. "You have a daughter, Mr. Rourke. Healthy lungs, strong grip, and apparently very impatient to meet the world. Your wife is tired but well and asking for you." Caleb entered the bedroom to find Grace propped up against pillows, exhausted and radiant, holding their daughter with a look of fierce protectiveness and overwhelming love. When she looked up at him, tears streaming down her face, she simply said, "Come meet our miracle." The baby was tiny and perfect, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to see everything despite being only minutes old. Caleb took her with trembling hands, this precious weight that represented everything he'd thought he'd lost forever: family, hope, continuity, the future. "Sarah Grace Rourke," Grace said softly, "after your first wife and me. Both of us loving this child, both of us part of the family we're building. If that's all right with you." Caleb couldn't speak, couldn't find words adequate to express what he was feeling, so he simply kissed Grace, then kissed their daughter's forehead, and let his tears speak what his voice couldn't. The years that followed were filled with the beautiful monotony of building a life. Cattle thriving, the ranch expanding, little Sarah growing into a fierce, curious child who seemed to inherit the best qualities of both her parents. A son followed 2 years later, named Thomas Charles after the reverend and grandfather who'd both played crucial roles in Caleb's redemption. The ranch prospered, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum as Caleb's reputation for quality stock and honest dealing spread through the territory. By their 5th anniversary, they were running 70 head and considering expansion. The house had grown too, rooms added as the family expanded, until it was no longer the small cabin they'd started with, but a proper home filled with the noise and chaos of children and life. On a warm evening in their 7th spring together, Caleb and Grace sat on their porch watching their children play by the creek, while the sun painted the mountains gold. Thomas was chasing his sister with a frog, both of them shrieking with laughter, while the newest addition, a daughter named Elizabeth after Grace's mother, dozed in Grace's arms. "Do you ever think about that day in the stagecoach?" Grace asked suddenly, "when I fell asleep against your shoulder?" "I think about it all the time," Caleb admitted. "Think about how terrified I was by that simple trust, how it cracked something open inside me that I'd thought was sealed forever." "I barely remember it," Grace said with a soft laugh. "I was so exhausted from the journey. But you've told me that story so many times, it feels like a memory even though I was half asleep when it happened." "That moment changed everything," Caleb said quietly. "Made me realize I was still capable of protecting something, of being trusted, of mattering to someone beyond just my skill with a gun. Everything that came after, the shootout, your father, this ranch, our family, all of it traces back to those 5 minutes when you trusted me enough to be vulnerable." Grace shifted Elizabeth to her shoulder, leaning into Caleb's side the way she had that day in the stagecoach, the gesture now familiar and beloved. "I'm glad I was too tired to think clearly. Conscious Grace might have been too proper to fall asleep on a stranger's shoulder. Exhausted Grace just knew she was safe and took what comfort she could find." "Best decision you ever made," Caleb said, kissing the top of her head. "Second best," Grace corrected. "Best decision was shooting Hadley when you went to face him. Everything else just followed from that." They sat in companionable silence, watching their children play as the evening deepened into twilight. This was the life Caleb had thought was buried in Colorado, the simple piece of family and land and work that mattered. But it was better than what he'd lost because it was built on full understanding of how fragile it all was, how precious, how worth fighting for every single day. Charles Alden visited a month later, now fully retired from banking and spending increasing amounts of time in Wyoming with his grandchildren. He'd softened over the years, the stern banker giving way to a doting grandfather who spoiled Sarah and Thomas shamelessly and seemed to find endless joy in their antics. "You've done well," Charles said to Caleb as they walked the property one afternoon. "The operation is solid, the family is thriving, and Grace is happier than I've ever seen her. You've more than proven yourself worthy of my investment." I had a lot of help," Caleb said. "From you, from Grace, from this entire community. I didn't do this alone." "No one ever does," Charles agreed. "But you did the hardest part. You chose to try again after having everything destroyed. You chose hope over despair, building over running, life over the slow death of isolation. That takes a particular kind of courage." They stood looking out over land that Caleb now knew in every season and mood, land that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The ranch that had started as a desperate hope was now a thriving operation, proof that second chances were real and redemption was possible. "Can I ask you something?" Caleb said. "That first night we met, when you questioned everything about me, did you already know you were going to back the ranch? Or did I actually convince you?" Charles smiled. "I knew within 5 minutes of meeting you that I was going to support this venture. Grace's letters had already convinced me of your character. I just needed to verify she hadn't let love blind her to practical concerns. And I needed to make sure you understood the full weight of what you were taking on. Not just the ranch, but the responsibility of loving someone who'd already buried one person she cared about." "I think about that conversation often," Caleb admitted. "About your insistence that I couldn't allow myself to die. That loving Grace carried the responsibility of honoring her survival. And have you honored it?" "Every day," Caleb said simply. "I choose life deliberately now. Choose hope, even when fear whispers that carrying this much is dangerous. Choose to be present and engaged instead of isolated and numb. It's not always easy, but it's always worth it." Charles clasped his shoulder, the gesture carrying weight of approval and affection. "Then I was right about you. And Grace was right to fight for you. Sometimes the best investments aren't about money at all." As autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, the community gathered at the Rourke Ranch for a celebration. It had become tradition, the anniversary of the final confrontation with the Hadley gang, transformed from a day of violence into a celebration of survival and community. Tables groaned under the weight of contributed food, children ran wild through the fields, and adults swapped stories and laughter under the vast Wyoming sky. Marshal Briggs, now retired but still respected, raised a glass to toast. To Caleb and Grace Rourke, who reminded us all that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the determination to build something beautiful despite it. To second chances and the community that makes them possible. The gathered crowd echoed the toast, voices rising in the evening air, and Caleb felt the full weight of how far he'd come. From a man so hollowed by grief that he'd spent 8 years courting death to someone surrounded by family and friends, standing on land he owned, holding the woman he loved while their children played at their feet. That night, after the guests had departed and the children were finally asleep, Caleb and Grace stood on their porch one last time, watching stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked softly. "Giving up drifting? Staying here instead of moving on?" Caleb pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. "Not once. Not for a single moment. You gave me back my life, Grace. Gave me permission to want things again, to hope again, to love again. Everything I have, this ranch, our children, this community, it all started with you refusing to let me die alone." "We saved each other," Grace said, the phrase that had become their private truth. "I needed you as much as you needed me. Needed to be brave again, to trust again, to believe that surviving loss didn't mean accepting a half-life." "I love you," Caleb said, the words as true now as they'd been 7 years ago when he'd first spoken them. "I love the life we've built. I love who I am when I'm with you. Thank you for falling asleep on my shoulder that day in the stagecoach. Thank you for seeing something worth saving in a man who'd given up on himself." Grace turned in his arms, her eyes bright in the starlight. "Thank you for being worth saving. Thank you for choosing to live fully instead of just existing. Thank you for giving me a love and a life that honors both what we've lost and what we've found." They kissed under the endless Wyoming sky, two people who'd survived tragedy and found their way to joy, who'd chosen hope when despair would have been easier, who'd built something lasting from the rubble of broken hearts and shattered dreams. And as they stood there, wrapped in each other and the peace of evening, Caleb thought about that moment in the stagecoach when everything had changed. A tired woman falling asleep against his shoulder, her trust so simple and complete that it had cracked open walls he'd spent 8 years building. He'd thought love was something he'd buried in Colorado, something that died with Sarah and their unborn child. But Grace had shown him that love wasn't a finite resource that expired with loss. It was something that could grow again, different but no less precious, honoring the past while building toward the future. The cowboy who hadn't wanted to fall in love had fallen anyway, and in falling had discovered he could fly after all. Not away from grief, but through it and beyond it, into a life rich with meaning and connection and the daily miracle of choosing hope over despair. And it had all started with a woman who'd been brave enough to be vulnerable, trusting enough to fall asleep on a stranger's shoulder, and fierce enough to fight for his life when he'd forgotten how to fight for it himself. In the house behind them, their children slept peacefully, dreaming whatever dreams children dream when they grow up surrounded by love and land and the security of belonging. Tomorrow would bring work and challenges and the endless demands of ranching in difficult country, but it would also bring laughter and family and the satisfaction of building something that would outlast them both. Caleb Rourke, once a man who'd spent 8 years running from ghosts, had finally found home. Not because he'd forgotten what he'd lost, but because he'd learned to carry it with grace while reaching for what he'd found. And that, he thought, as Grace's hand found his in the darkness, was the truest definition of redemption he'd ever known. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent and eternal, bearing witness to one small story of love reclaimed and life rebuilt. Just another evening on a Wyoming ranch, just another couple standing on their porch watching nightfall. Ordinary and miraculous, in equal measure, like all the best things in life. And in the morning, they'd wake up and choose it all over again, the work and the love, and the life they'd built together. Choose hope deliberately, the way Charles had challenged Caleb to do all those years ago. Choose each other, choose their children, choose this land and this community and this beautiful, difficult, precious life. because that's what you did when you'd been given a second chance at everything that mattered. You honored it by living fully, loving deeply, and never ever forgetting how miraculous it was to be alive and home and surrounded by people who made the struggle worthwhile. The end.